I forgot. Attend, O reader, our tale of fantasy. Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. We are reading more 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Uh, I am currently waiting for my pot of tea to finish brewing, actually. But while I wait, we can talk about this and that. How have you all been? I've been good myself. Uh, I think that solo RPG stream we did on Monday went over swimmingly. I had a great time. Uh, is there anyone I need to shout out while I'm at it? I think JDR 5866 is new. Welcome to the igloo. Um, Question of the day. Anybody else? I already mentioned those raids last stream. But yeah, I had a great time playing that solo RPG. I'm definitely gonna do more of it. I have fun things planned. Yeah, I don't know. By the way, I think if we type this command in the chat, yeah, there's the USG. Don't worry, that's also alias to several things that people would probably guess, like USG or read streamers. But yeah, that's a Discord full of people who do reading for streams. Yeah, there you go. See, it's aliased. Yeah, I did my best to, when I was setting up the commands for this bot, to try and alias them to things that people guess. Like, for my Switch friend code, it's like Switch and friend code and FC and like two other things. Um, there's a couple of secret, Easter egg commands, I think, still left in there. So, do feel free to look for those if you're familiar. Uh, the biggest one that I think is going to get used a lot is the BRB command, just because I tend to have a BRB in the middle of my streams. That's a real thing that happens. Now Library has decided it is real box dig time. He's like, Papa, you took too long. Penguin. That would be a good one, actually. Like some kind of winter themed commands. That I should do that. There are one or two of them in there somewhere. Uh, but I should add more. Penguin is clever. Library has decided it is real litterbox hours now. Well, it's better than him not using it, I guess. Either way, I think the tea has just gone off. So, I will. That needs a stir, but yeah, there we go. We will let the tea has completed its journey and actually become tea instead of leaves with water in it. And so now we can actually begin our journey back into 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Once I poured myself a cup of tea here. Fun fact, did you know, much like any other liquid, water changes viscosity with temperature. But you can ordinarily only really notice it with water because the difference is so slight. You only notice it through sound, which makes this this podcast the perfect way to learn that, if you ask me. Anyway, let's dive into chapter 15, chapter 15, A Walk on the Bottom of the Sea. To give you a very fast last time on before we do, actually. This man heard our main character, whose name unfortunately escapes me. We'll be reading it eventually. Uh, is a studier of ocean life, and got talked into trying to hunt down a narwhal that has been assailing ships. Well, turns out that narwhal is actually a submarine, and not any ordinary submersible, the Nautilus. Lurking so many streams right now. Well, I'm glad to have you here too. Come here, library. Come on, the public want to see you. He's looking up at me like, are you sure the public want to see me? There we go. Look at this lad. Oh, never mind. There he goes. Fickle as ever, library. He at least doesn't mind being on camera. Magnus is not a big fan. Where was I? Oh yeah, this guy, got sucked into being on a, essentially a hunting mission for this submersible that they thought was a narwhal and turned out to be a submarine. In the middle of a storm, the ship was destroyed, and they fell overboard, along with their, manservant, I guess is the best way to put it. Their manservant, Conseil, and a French harpoonist, a French whale harpooner, who is voiced by me with an atrocious French accent, so prepare your ears. And they've all three fallen overboard, and now they're on the Nautilus, and after we've spent several chapters marveling at how cool the Nautilus is, we're going to go on an undersea hunting trip. And that's where we're getting started with Chapter 15. This cell was, to speak correctly, the arsenal and wardrobe of the Nautilus. A dozen diving apparatuses hung from the partition waiting our use. Ned Land, on seeing them, showed evident repugnance to dress himself in one. But, my worthy Ned, the forests of the island of Crespo are nothing but submarine forests. Good, said the disappointed harpooner, who saw his dreams of fresh meat fade away. And you, Monsieur Aronnax, are you going to dress yourselves in these clothes? There's no alternative, Master Ned. As you please, sir, replied the harpooner, shrugging his shoulders. But as for me, unless I am forced, I will never get into one. No one will force you, Master Ned, said Captain Nemo. Is Conseil going to risk it? Asked Ned. I follow my master wherever he goes, replied Conseil. At the captain's call, 2 of the ship's crew came to help us dress in these heavy and impervious clothes, made of India rubber without seam and constructed expressly to resist considerable pressure. One would have thought it a suit of armor, both supple and resisting. This suit formed trousers and waistcoat. The trousers were finished off with thick boots, weighted with heavy leaden soles. The texture of the waistcoat was held together by bands of copper, which crossed the chest, protecting it from the great pressure of the water, and leaving the lungs free to act. The sleeves ended in gloves, which in no way restrained the movement of the hands. There was a vast difference noticeable between these consummate apparatuses and the old cork breastplates, jackets, and other contrivances in vogue during the 18th century. There's library. Oh, other side. There's library. It's a good spot to mirror, Kitty. Maybe stay there. Captain Nemo and one of his companions, a sort of Hercules who must have possessed great strength, Conseil, and myself were soon enveloped in the dresses. There remained nothing more to be done but to unclose our heads in the metal box. But before proceeding to this operation, I asked the captain's permission to examine the guns. One of the Nautilus men gave me a simple gun, the butt end of which, made of steel, hollow in the center, was rather large. It served as a reservoir for compressed air, which a valve, worked by a spring, allowed to escape into a metal tube. A box of projectiles in a groove in the thickness of the butt end contained about 20 of these electric balls, which, by the means of a spring, were forced in the barrel of the gun. As soon as one shot was fired, another was ready. Captain Nemo, this arm is perfect and easily handled. I only ask to be allowed to try it, but how shall we gain the bottom of the sea? At the moment, at the moment... Oh, wait, no, that's Captain Nemo. At the moment, Professor, the Nautilus is stranded in 5 fathoms, and we have nothing to do but start. But how shall we get off of here? You shall see. Captain Nemo thrust his head into the helmet. Conseil and I did the same, not without hearing an ironical, "Good sport," from the Canadian. The upper part of our dress terminated in a copper collar, upon which was screwed the metal helmet. 3 holes, protected by thick glass, allowed us to see in all directions, by simply turning our head in the interior of the headdress. As soon as it was in position, the roquois-roll apparatus on our backs began to act, and for my part I could breathe with ease. With the Ruhmkorff lamp hanging from my belt and the gun in my hand, I was ready to set out. But to speak the truth, imprisoned in these heavy garments and glued to the deck by my leaden soles, it was impossible for me to take a step. But this state of things was provided for. I felt myself being pushed into a little room contiguous to the wardrobe room. My companions followed, towed along in the same way. I heard a watertight door, furnished with stopper plates, close upon us, and we were wrapped in profound darkness. After some minutes, a loud hissing was heard. I felt the cold mount from my feet to my chest. Evidently, from some part of the vessel they had, by means of a tap, given entrance to the water, which was invading us, and with which the room was soon filled. A second door cut in the side of the Nautilus then opened, and we saw a faint light. In another instant, our feet trod the bottom of the sea. And now, how can I retrace the impression left upon me by that walk under the waters? Words are impotent to relate such wonders. Captain Nemo walked in front. His companion followed some steps behind, Conseil and I remaining near each other, as if an exchange of words had been possible through our metallic cases. I no longer felt the weight of my clothing, or of my shoes, or of my reservoir of air or thick helmet, in the midst of which my head rattled like an almond in its shell. Sorry, I was making sure the cats weren't causing problems. The light, which hit the soil 30 feet below the surface of the ocean, astonished me by its power. The solar rays shone through the watery mass easily, and dissipated all color, and I clearly distinguished objects at a distance of 150 yards. Beyond that, the tints darkened into fine gradations of ultramarine and faded into vague obscurity. Truly, this water which surrounded me was but another air denser than the terrestrial atmosphere, but almost as transparent. Above me was the calm surface of the sea. We were walking a fine, even sand, not wrinkled, as on a flat shore, which retains the impressions of the billows. This dazzling carpet, really a reflector, repelled the rays of the sun with wonderful intensity, which accounted for the vibration which penetrated every atom of liquid. Shall I be believed when I say that at the depth of 30 feet I could see as if I was in broad daylight? For a quarter of an hour I trod on this sand, sown with the impalpable dust of shells. The hull of the Nautilus, resembling a long shoal, disappeared by degrees, but its lantern, when darkness should overtake us in the waters, would help to guide us on board its distinct rays. Soon forms of objects outlined in the distance were discernible. I recognized magnificent rocks hung with a tapestry of zoophytes of the most particular kind, and I was at first struck by the beautiful effect of this medium. It was then 10 in the morning. The rays of the sun struck the surface of the waves at a rather oblique angle, and at the touch of their light, decomposed by refraction through a prism, rocks, flowers, plants, shells, and polypi were shaded at the edges by 7 solar colors. It was marvelous, a feast for the eyes, this perfect complication of colored tints, a perfect kaleidoscope of green, yellow, orange, violet, indigo, and blue. In one word, the whole palette of an enthusiastic colorist. Why could I not communicate to Conseil the lively sensations which were mounting to my brain and rival him in expressions of admiration? For aught I knew, Captain Nemo and his companion might be able to exchange thoughts by means of signs previously agreed upon. So, for want of better, I talked to myself. I declaimed in the copper box which covered my head, thereby expending more air and vain words than was perhaps wise. Various kinds of isis, clusters of pure tuft coral, prickly fungi, and anemones formed a brilliant garden of flowers, decked with their collarets of blue tentacles, sea stars studding the sandy bottom. It was a real grief to me to crush under my feet the brilliant specimens of mollusks, which strewed the ground by thousands, of hammerheads, docineae, veritable bounding shells, of staircases and red helmet shells and angel wings, and many others produced by this inexhaustible ocean. But we were bound to walk, so we went on, whilst above our heads waved medusae whose umbrellas of opal or rose pink and scalloped with a band of blue sheltered us from the rays of the sun, and fiery pelagiae, which in the darkness would have strewn our path with phosphorescent light. All these wonders I saw in the space of a quarter of a mile, scarcely stopping, and following Captain Nemo, who beckoned me on by signs. Soon the nature of the soil changed. To the sturdy plain to the sandy plain succeeded an extent of slimy mud which the Americans would call ooze, composed of equal parts of siliceous and coloraceous shells. We then traveled over a plain of seaweed, of wild and luxuriant vegetation. This sward was of close texture, and soft to the feet, and rivaled the softest carpet woven by the hand of man. But whilst verdure was spread at our feet, it did not abandon our heads. A light network of marine plants, of that inexhaustible family of seaweeds of which more than 2,000 kinds are known, grew on the surface of the water. I noticed that the green plants kept nearer the top of the sea, whilst the red were at a greater depth, leaving to the black or brown the care of forming gardens and parterres in the remote beds of the ocean. We had quitted the Nautilus about an hour and a half. It was near noon, I knew by the perpendicularity of the sun's rays, which were no longer refracted. The magical colors disappeared by degrees, and the shades of emerald and sapphire were effaced. We walked with a regular step, which rang upon the ground with astonishing intensity. The slightest noise was transmitted with a quickness to which the ear is unaccustomed on the earth. Indeed, water is a better conductor of sound than air, in the ratio of 4 to 1. At this period the earth sloped downwards, and the light took a uniform tint. We were at a depth of 105 yards and 20 inches, undergoing a pressure of 6 atmospheres. At this depth I could still see the rays of the sun, though feebly. To their intense brilliancy had succeeded a reddish twilight, the lowest state between day and night, but we could still see well enough. It was not necessary to resort to the Ruhmkorff apparatus as yet. At this moment Captain Nemo stopped. He waited till I joined him and then pointed to an obscure mass looming in the shadow at a short distance. "It's the forest of the island of Crespo," thought I, and I was not mistaken. Ooh, that's good. That's the citrus mint licorice tea. Very good decaf option if you can get your hands on it. I don't know if they have an online shop. I should check and maybe see if they want to indulge in a sponsorship. Who knows? Magnus, you gotta leave the walls alone, man. I put a lot of work into this paint. Thank you. Let's dive into Chapter 16, A Submarine Forest. We'd at last arrived on the borders of this forest, doubtless one of the finest of Captain Nemo's immense domains. He looked upon it as his own, and considered he had the same right over it that the first men had in the first days of the world. And indeed, who would have disputed with him the possession of this submarine property? What other hardier pioneer would come, hatchet in hand, to cut down the dark copses? This forest was composed of large tree plants, and the moment we penetrated under its vast arcades, I was struck by the singular position of their branches, a position I had not yet observed. Not an herb which carpeted the ground, nor a branch which closed the trees, was either broken nor bent, nor did they extend horizontally. All stretched up to the surface of the ocean. Not a filament, not a ribbon, however thin they might be, but kept as straight as a rod of iron. The fuchsiae and lilianas grew in rigid perpendicular lines due to the density of the element which had produced them. Motionless yet, when bent to one side by the hand, they directly resumed their former position. Truly, it was the region of perpendicularity. I soon accustomed myself to this fantastic position, as well as to the comparative darkness which surrounded us. The soil of the forest seemed covered with sharp blocks that were difficult to avoid. The submarine flora struck me as being very perfect, and richer even than it would have been in the Arctic or tropical zones, where these productions are not so plentiful. But for some minutes I involuntarily confounded the genera, taking animals for plants, and who would not have been mistaken? The fauna and the flora are too closely allied in this submarine world. These plants are self-propagated, and the principle of their existence is in the water, which upholds and nourishes them. The greater number, instead of leaves, shoot forth blades of capricious shapes, comprised within a scale of colors: pink, carmine, green, olive, fawn, and brown. "Curious anomaly, fantastic element," said an ingenious naturalist, "in which the animal kingdom blossoms and the vegetable does not." In about an hour, Captain Nemo gave the signal to halt. I, for my part, was not sorry. We stretched ourselves under an arbor of alariae, the long, thin blades of which stood up like arrows. This short rest seemed delicious to me. There was nothing wanting but the charm of conversation, but impossible to speak, impossible to answer. I put only my great copperhead to Conseil's, and saw the worthy fellow's eyes glistening with delight, and to show his satisfaction he shook himself in his breastplate of air in the most comical way in the world. After 4 hours of this walking, I was surprised not to find myself dreadfully hungry. How to account for this state of the stomach I could not tell. But instead, I felt an insurmountable desire to sleep, which happens to all divers. And my eyes soon closed behind the thick glasses. I fell into a heavy slumber, which the movement alone had prevented before. Captain Nemo and his robust companion, stretched in the clear crystal, set the example. How long I remained buried in this drowsiness I cannot judge, but when I woke, the sun seemed sinking toward the horizon. Captain Nemo had already risen, and I was beginning to stretch my limbs when an unexpected apparition brought me briskly to my feet. A few steps off, a monstrous sea spider, about 38 inches high, was watching me with squinting eyes, ready to spring upon me. Though my diver's dress was thick enough to defend me from the bite of this animal, I could not help shuddering with horror. Conseil and the sailor of the Nautilus awoke at this moment. Captain Nemo pointed out the hideous crustacean, which a blow from the butt end of the gun knocked over, and I saw the horrible claws of the monster writhe in terrible convulsions. This incident reminded me that other animals more to be feared might haunt these obscure depths, against whose attacks my diving dress would not protect me. I had never thought of it before, but I now resolved to be upon my guard. Indeed, I thought that this halt would mark the termination of our walk. Library. There we go. Sorry, the cats are not allowed in the kitchen, so if you see them climbing around in there, yell in the chat. Perhaps I should have a command that's like mischief or cats or something that lets me know that you guys see the cats causing problems behind me. Yeah, Magnus, I'm talking about you. Anyway, marked the termination of our walk. That's where we were. But I was mistaken, for instead of returning to the Nautilus, Captain Nemo continued his bold excursion. The ground was still on the incline. Its declivity seemed to be getting greater, and to be leading us to greater depths. It must have been about 3 o'clock when we reached a narrow valley between high perpendicular walls situated about 75 fathoms deep. Thanks to the perfection of our apparatus, we were 45 fathoms below the limit which nature seems to have imposed on man as to his submarine excursions. I say 75 fathoms, but I had no instrument by which to judge the distance. But I knew that even in the clearest waters the solar rays could not penetrate further than that, and accordingly the darkness deepened. At 10 paces not an object was visible. I was groping my way along when I suddenly saw a brilliant white light. Captain Nemo had just put his electric apparatus into use. His companion did the same, and Conseil and I followed their example. By turning a screw, I established a communication between the wire and the spiral glass, and the sea, lit by our 4 lanterns, was illuminated for a circle of 36 yards. As we walked, I thought the light of our room corps apparatus could not fail to draw some inhabitant from its dark couch, but if they did approach us, they at least kept a respectful distance from the hunters. Several times I saw Captain Nemo stop, put his gun to his shoulder, and after some moments drop it and walk on. At last, after about 4 hours, this marvelous excursion came to an end. A wall of superb rocks and an imposing mass rose before us, in a heap of gigantic blocks, an enormous steep granite shore, forming dark grottos, but which presented no practicable slope. It was the prop of the island of Crespo. It was the earth. Captain Nemo stopped suddenly. A gesture of his brought us all to a halt, and however desirous I might be to scale the wall, I was obliged to stop. Here ended Captain Nemo's domains, and he would not go beyond them. Further on was a portion of the globe he might not trample upon. The return finally began. Captain Nemo had returned to the head of his little band, directing their course without hesitation. I thought we were not following the same route to return to the Nautilus. The new road was very steep and consequently very painful. We approached the surface of the sea rapidly, but this return to the upper strata was not so sudden as to cause relief from the pressure too rapidly, which might have produced serious disorder in our organization, and brought on internal lesions so fatal to divers. Very soon light reappeared and grew, and the sun being low on the horizon, the refraction edged the different objects with a spectral ring. At 10 yards and a half deep we walked amidst a shoal of little fishes of all kinds, more numerous than the birds of the air, and also more agile. But no aquatic game worthy of a shot as yet had met our gaze, when at that moment I saw the captain shoulder his gun quickly and follow a moving object into the shrubs. He fired. I heard a slight hissing, and a creature fell, stunned, at some distance away from us. It was a magnificent sea otter, and an anhydrus, the only exclusively marine quadruped. This otter was 5 feet long, and it must have been very valuable. Its skin, chestnut brown above and silvery underneath, would have made one of those beautiful furs so sought after in the Russian and Chinese markets. The fineness and the luster of its coat could certainly fetch 80 lira. I admired this curious mammal, with its rounded head ornamented with short ears, its round eyes and white whiskers like those of a cat, with webbed feet and nails and tufted tail. This precious animal, hunted and tracked by fishermen, has now become very rare, and taken refuge chiefly in the northern parts of the Pacific, where probably its race would soon become extinct. Captain Nemo's companion took the beast, threw it over his shoulder, and we continued our journey. For 1 hour a plain of sand lay stretched before us. Sometimes it rose within 2 yards and some inches of the surface of the water. I then saw our image clearly reflected, drawn inversely, and above us appeared an identical group reflecting our movements and our actions. In a word, like us in every point, except that they walked with their heads downward and their feet in the air. Another effect I noticed was the passage of thick clouds which formed and vanished rapidly. But on reflection I understood that these seeming clouds were due to the varying thickness of the reeds at the bottom, and I could even see the fleecy foam which their broken tops multiplied on the water, and the shadows of large birds passing over our heads, whose rapid flight I could discern on the surface of the sea. On this occasion I was witness to one of the finest gunshots which ever made the nerves of a hunter thrill. A large bird of great breadth of wing, clearly visible, approached, hovering over us. Captain Nemo's companion shouldered his gun and fired when it was only a few yards above the waves. The creature fell stunned, and the force of its fall brought it within the reach of the dexterous hunter's grasp. It was an albatross of the finest kind. Our march had not been interrupted by this incident. For 2 hours we followed these sandy plains, then fields of algae very disagreeable to cross. Candidly, I could do no more when I saw a glimmer of light, which for a half-mile broke the darkness of the waters. It was the lantern of the Nautilus. Before 20 minutes were over, we should be on board, and I should be able to breathe with ease, for it seemed that my reservoir supplied air very deficient in oxygen. But I did not reckon on an accidental meeting which delayed our arrival for some time. I had remained some steps behind when I presently saw Captain Nemo coming hurriedly towards me. With his strong hand he bent me to the ground, his companion doing the same to Conseil. At first I knew not what to think of this sudden attack, but I was soon reassured by seeing the captain lie down beside me and remain immovable. I was stretched on the ground just under a shelter of a bush of algae, when, raising my head, I saw some enormous mass, casting phosphorescent gleams, pass blusteringly by. My blood froze in my veins as I recognized 2 formidable sharks which threatened us. There was a couple of tintorees, terrible creatures, with enormous tails and a dull glassy stare, the phosphorescent matter ejected from holes pierced around the muzzle. They were monstrous brutes, which would crush a whole man in their jaws. I did not know whether Conseil stopped to classify them. For my part, I noticed their silver bellies and their huge mouths bristling with teeth, from a very unscientific although I did so from a very unscientific point of view, and more as a possible victim than a naturalist. Happily, the voracious creatures did not see well. They passed without seeing us, brushing us with their brownish fins, and we escaped by a miracle from a danger greater than meeting a tiger full face in the forest. Half an hour after, guided by the electric light, we reached the Nautilus. The outside door had been left open, and Captain Nemo closed it as soon as we had entered the first cell. He then pressed a knob. I heard the pumps working in the midst of the vessel, felt the water sinking from around me, and in a few moments the cell was entirely empty. The inside door then opened, and we entered the vestry. There our diving dress was taken off. Not without some trouble, and fairly worn out from want of food and sleep, I returned to my room, in great wonder at this surprising excursion at the bottom of the sea. That's good tea. What do you think, library? Have you spent enough time in the box? Not once, but twice. He's busy cleaning his beans. He doesn't care. He's like, I couldn't get it all off my beans, Dad. I need to clean. That's fair. Better than you tracking it around. Alright. Let's dive into chapter 17, 4,000 Leagues Under the Pacific. We're a fifth of the way there. The next morning, the 18th of November, I had quite recovered from my fatigues of the day before, and I went up on the platform, just as the second lieutenant was uttering his daily phrase. I was admiring the magnificent aspect of the ocean when Captain Nemo appeared. He didn't seem to be aware of my presence, and began a series of astronomical observations. Then, when he'd finished, he went and leant on the cage of the watchlight, and gazed abstractedly on the ocean. In the meanwhile, a number of the sailors of the Nautilus, all strong and healthy men, had come up onto the platform. They came to draw up the nets that had been laid all night. These sailors were evidently of different nations, although the European type was visible in all of them. I recognized some unmistakable Irishmen, Frenchmen, some slaves, a Greek, and a Candiote. They were civil and only used that odd language among themselves, the origin of which I could not guess, neither could I question them. The nets were hauled in. They were a large kind of chalut, like those on the Normandy coasts, great pockets that the waves and chain, fixed in the smaller meshes, kept open. These pockets, drawn by iron poles, swept through the water and gathered everything in their way. That day they brought up curious specimens from these productive coasts. I reckon that the haul had brought in more than 900 weight of fish. It was a fine haul, but not to be wondered at. Indeed, the nets are let down for several hours, and they enclose in their meshes an infinite variety. We had no lack of excellent food, and the rapidity of the Nautilus and the attraction of the electric light could always renew our supply. These several productions of the sea were immediately lowered through the panel to the steward's room, some to be eaten fresh, and others pickled. The fishing having ended, the provision of air renewed, I thought that the Nautilus was about to continue its submarine excursion, and I was preparing to return to my room, when, without further preamble, the captain turned to me, saying, Professor, is not this ocean gifted with real life? It has its tempers and its gentle moods. Yesterday it slept as we did, and now it is woke after a quiet night. Look, he continued. It wakes under the caresses of the sun. It's going to renew its diurnal existence. It is an interesting study to watch the play of its organization. It has a pulse, arteries, spasms, and I agree with the learned Maori, who discovered in it a circulation as real as the circulation of blood in animals. Yes, the ocean has indeed circulation, and to promote it, the Creator has caused things to multiply in it. Caloric salt and animalculae. Animalculae? Yeah, animalculae. I like that better. When Captain Nemo spoke thus, he seemed altogether changed, and aroused an extraordinary emotion in me. Also, true existence is there. I can imagine the foundations of nautical towns, clusters of submarine houses, which like the Nautilus, would ascend every morning to breathe at the surface of the water. Free towns, independent cities, yet who knows whether some despot... Captain Nemo finished his sentence with a violent gesture, then addressing me as if to chase away some sorrowful thought. Monsieur Aronnax, do you know the depth of the ocean? I only know, Captain, what the principal soundings have taught us. Could you tell me them so that I can suit them to my purpose? These are some that I remember. If I'm not mistaken, a depth of 8,000 yards has been found in the North Atlantic and 2,500 yards in the Mediterranean. The most remarkable soundings have been made in the South Atlantic, near the 35th parallel. They gave 12,000 yards, 14,000 yards, and 15,000 yards. To sum it all up, it's reckoned that if the bottom of the sea were leveled, its mean depth would be about 1 3/4 leagues. Well, Professor, we shall show you better than that, I hope. As to the mean depth of the part of the Pacific, I tell you it's only 4,000 yards. Having said this, Captain Nemo went toward the panel and disappeared down the ladder. I followed him and went into the large drawing room. The screw was immediately put in motion, and the log gave 20 miles an hour. During the days and weeks that passed, Captain Nemo was very sparing of his visits. I seldom saw him. The lieutenant pricked the ship's course regularly on the chart, so I could always tell exactly the route of the Nautilus. Nearly every day, for some time, the panels of the drawing room were open, and we never tired of penetrating the mysteries of the submarine world. The general direction of the Nautilus was southeast, and it kept between 100 and 150 yards of depth. One day, however, I do not know why, being drawn diagonally by means of the inclined planes, it touched the bed of the sea. The thermometer indicated a temperature of 4.25 centigrade, a temperature that at this depth seemed common to all latitudes. At 3 o'clock in the morning of the 26th of November, the Nautilus crossed the Tropic of Cancer at 172 degrees longitude. On the 27th instant, it sighted the Sandwich Islands, where Cook died, February 14th, 1779. We had then gone 4,860 leagues from our starting point. In the morning, when I went on the platform, I saw 2 miles to windward Hawaii, the largest of the 7 islands that form the group. I saw clearly the cultivated ranges and the several mountain chains that run parallel with the side, and the volcanoes that overtop Manoa Rea, which rise 5,000 yards above the level of the sea. Excuse me. Besides other things the nets brought up were several flabellariae and graceful polypi that are peculiar to that part of the ocean. The direction of the Nautilus was still to the southeast. It crossed the equator December 1st in 142 degrees longitude, and on the 4th of the same month, after crossing rapidly and without anything in particular occurring, we sighted the Marquesas group. I saw 3 miles off Martin's Peak and Nokahiva, the largest of the group that belongs to France. I only saw the woody mountains against the horizon, because Captain Nemo did not wish to bring the ship to the wind. There the nets brought up some beautiful specimens of fish, some with azure fins and tails like gold, the flesh of which is unrivaled, some nearly destitute of scales but of exquisite flavor, others with bony jaws and yellow-tinged gills as good as bonitos, all fish that would be of use to us. After leaving these charming islands protected by the French flag, from the 4th to the 11th of December the Nautilus sailed over about 2,000 miles. During the daytime of the 11th of December, I was busy reading in the large drawing room. Ned Land and Conseil watched the luminous water through the half-open panels. The Nautilus was immovable. While its reservoirs were filled, it kept at a depth of about 1,000 yards, a region rarely visited in the ocean, and in which large fish were seldom seen. I was then reading a charming book by Jean Mace, The Slaves of the Stomach, and I was learning some valuable lessons from it when Conseil interrupted me. "Will master come here a moment?" "What's the matter, Conseil?" "I want master to look." I rose, went, and leaned on my elbows before the panes, and watched. In a full electric light, an enormous black mass, quite immovable, was suspended in the midst of the waters. I watched it attentively, seeking to find out the nature of this gigantic cetacean. But a sudden thought crossed my mind. A vessel? Yes, a disabled ship that is sunk perpendicularly. Ned Land was right. We were close to a vessel of which the tattered shrouds still hung from their chains. The keel seemed to be in good order, and it had been wrecked at most some few hours. 3 stumps of mast, broken off about 2 feet above the bridge, showed that the vessel had had to sacrifice its masts. But lying on its side, it had filled, and it was heeling over to port. This skeleton of what had once been was a sad spectacle as it lay lost under the waves, but sadder still was the sight of the bridge where some corpses, bound with ropes, were still lying. I counted 5, 4 men, one of whom was standing at the helm, and a woman standing by the poop deck holding an infant in her arms. She was quite young. I could distinguish her features, which the water had not decomposed, by the brilliant light from the Nautilus. In one despairing effort she had raised her infant above her head, poor little thing, whose arms encircled its mother's neck. The attitude of the 4 sailors was frightful, distorted as they were by their convulsive movements, whilst making a last effort to free themselves from the cords that bound them to the vessel. The steersman alone, calm, with a grave, clear face, his grey hair glued to his forehead, and his hand clutching the wheel of the helm, seemed even then to be guiding the 3 broken masts through the depths of the ocean. What a scene! We were struck dumb. Our hearts beat fast. Sorry, one moment. Oh no, that's loud. Never mind. Our hearts beat fast before this shipwreck, taken as it were from life and photographed in its last moments. And I saw already, coming toward it with hungry eyes, enormous sharks, attracted by the human flesh. However, the Nautilus, turning, went around the submerged vessel, and in one instant I read on the stern, the Florida Sunderland. Chapter 18, Vanikoro. This terrible spectacle was the forerunner of the series of maritime catastrophes that the Nautilus was destined to meet in its route. As long as it went through more frequented waters, we often saw the hulls of shipwrecked vessels that were rotting in the depths, and deeper down, cannons, bullets, anchors, chains, 1,000 other iron materials eaten up by rust. However, on the 11th of December, we sighted the Pomtau Islands, the old dangerous group of Bougainville, that extend over a space of 500 leagues at east-southeast to west-northwest, from the island Duchy to that of Lazareff. This group covers an area of 370 square leagues, and it's formed of 60 groups of islands, among which the Gambier group is remarkable, over which the let's try that sentence again. Or at least a chunk of it. It's formed of 60 groups of islands, among which the Gambier group is remarkable, over which France exercises sway. These are coral islands, slowly raised but continuous, created by the daily work of polypi. Then this new island will be joined later on to the neighboring groups, and a 5th continent will stretch from New Zealand and New Caledonia, and from thence to the Marquesas. One day, when I was suggesting this theory to Captain Nemo, he replied coldly, "The Earth does not want new continents, but new men." Chance had conducted the Nautilus toward the island of Clermont-Tonnerre, one of the most curious of the group, that was discovered in 1822 by Captain Bell of the Minerva. I could study now the madreporial system to which are due the islands in this ocean. Madrepores, which must not be mistaken for corals, have a tissue lined with a calcareous crust, and the modifications of its structure have induced Monsieur Milne Edwards, my worthy master, to class them into 5 sections. The animalcule that the marine polypus secretes live by millions at the bottom of their cells. Their calcareous high in calcium deposits become rocks, reefs, and large and small islands. Here they form a ring, surrounding with a little inland lake that communicates with the sea by means of gaps. There they make barriers of reefs like those on the coasts of New Caledonia and the various Pomoton Islands. In other places, like those at Reunion and at Maurice, they raise fringed reefs, high, straight walls near which the depth of the ocean is considerable. Some cable lengths off the shores of the island of Clermont, I admire the gigantic work accomplished by these microscopical workers. These walls are especially the work of those madrepores known as millipores, porites, madrepores, and estrellas. These polypi are found particularly in the rough beds of the sea, near the surface, and consequently it is from the upper part that they begin their operations, in which they bury themselves by degree with the debris of the secretions that support them. Such is, at least, Darwin's theory, who thus explains the formation of the atolls, a superior theory, to my mind, to that given at the foundation of the madreporical works, summits of volcanoes or mountains that are submerged some feet below the level of the sea. I could observe closely these curious walls, for perpendicularly they were more than 300 yards deep, and our electric sheets lighted up this calcareous material brilliantly. Replying to a question, Conseil asked me as to this time these colossal barriers took to be raised. I astonished him by telling him that learned men reckoned it to be about 1/8 of an inch in 100 years. Towards evening, Clermont-Tonnerre was lost in the distance, and the route of the Nautilus was sensibly changed. After having crossed the Tropic of Capricorn in 135 degrees longitude, it sailed west-northwest, making again for the tropical zone. Although the summer sun was very strong, we did not suffer from heat, for at 15 or 20 fathoms below the surface, the temperature didn't rise above from 10 to 12 degrees. I assume those are degrees centigrade. On the 15th of December, we left to the east the bewitching group of the Societies and the graceful Tahiti, Queen of the Pacific. I saw in the morning, some miles to the windward, the elevated summits of the island. These waters furnished our table with excellent fish, mackerel, bonito, some variety of a sea serpent. On the 25th of December, the Nautilus sailed in the midst of the New Hebrides, discovered by Quiros in 1606, and that Bougainville explored in 1768, and to which Cook gave its present name in 1773. This group is composed primarily of 9 large islands that form a band of 120 leagues, north-north-south to south-southwest. Between 15 degrees and 2 degrees south latitude, and 164 degrees and 168 degrees longitude. We passed tolerably near to the island of Aroe, that at noon looked like a mass of green woods, surmounted by a peak of giant height. That day being Christmas Day, Ned Land seemed to regret sorely the non-celebration of Christmas, the family fete of which Protestants are so fond. I had not seen Captain Nemo for a week, when, on the morning of the 27th, he came into the large drawing-room, always seeming as if he had seen you 5 minutes before. I was busily tracing the route of the Nautilus on the planisphere. The captain came up to me, put his finger on one spot on the chart, and said this single word: Vanikor. The effect was magical. It was the name of the islands on which La Pérouse had been lost, and I rose suddenly. The Nautilus has brought us to Vanikor? Yes, Professor. And I can visit the celebrated islands where the Boussole and the Astrolabe struck? If you like, Professor. When shall we be there? We are there now. Followed by Captain Nemo, I went on up to the platform and greedily scanned the horizon. To the northeast, 2 volcanic islands emerged of unequal size, surrounded by a coral reef that measured 40 miles in circumference. We were close to Vanikoro, really the one to which Dumont d'Urville gave the name of Isla de la Recherche, and exactly facing the little harbor of Vanneau, situated in 16 degrees 4 minutes south. 16 degrees 4 minutes south latitude and 164 degrees 32 minutes east longitude. The earth seemed covered with verdure, from the shore to the summits in the interior that were crowned by Mount Capogo, 476 feet high. The Nautilus, having passed the outer belt of the rocks by a narrow strait, found itself among the breakers, where the sea was from 30 to 40 fathoms deep. Under the verdant shade of some mangroves, I perceived some savages, who appeared greatly surprised at our approach. You gross, they're native people, not savage. Whatever. That's my modern commentary talking. In the long black body moving between wind and water, did they not see some formidable cetacean that they regarded with suspicion? Just then, Captain Nemo asked me what I knew about the wreck of La Pérouse. Only what everyone knows, Captain, I replied. And could you tell me what everyone knows about it? Easily. I related to him all the last works of Dumont d'Urville had made known, works from which the following is a brief account. La Pérouse and his second, Captain de Langlais, were sent by Louis the 16th, I did read that correctly the first time, were sent by Louis the 16th in 1785 on a voyage of circumnavigation. They embarked on the corvettes Boussole and the Astrolabe, neither of which were again heard of. In 1791, the French government, justly uneasy as to the fate of these two sloops, manned two large merchantmen, the Recherche and the Espérance, which left Brest the 28th of September under the command of Bruni de Entrecastel. 2 months after, they learned from Bowen, the commander of the Albemarle, that the debris of shipwrecked vessels had been seen on the coasts of New Georgia. But D'Entrecasteaux, ignoring this communication, rather uncertain besides, directed his course toward the Admiralty Islands, mentioned in a report of Captain Hunter's as being the place where La Pérouse was wrecked. They sought in vain. The Espérance and the Recherche passed before Vanikoro without stopping there, and in fact this voyage was most disastrous. It cost D'Entrecasteaux his life, and those of 2 of his lieutenants, besides several of his crew. Captain Dillon, a shrewd old Pacific sailor, was the first to find unmistakable traces of the wrecks. On the 15th of May, 1824, his vessel, the St. Patrick, passed close to Tikopia, one of the New Hebrides. There Lascar came alongside in a canoe, sold him the handle of a sword in silver that bore the print of characters engraved on the hilt. The Lascar that pretended that 6 years before, during a stay at Vanikoro, he'd seen 2 Europeans that belonged to some vessels that run aground on the reefs some years ago. Dillon guessed that he meant La Pérouse, whose disappearance had troubled the whole world. He tried to get on to Vanikoro, where, according to the Lascar, he would find numerous debris of the wreck, but winds and tides prevented him. "Hi, Raz. Happy to see you here." Dillon returned to Calcutta. There he interested the Asiatic Society and the Indian Company in his discovery. A vessel, to which was given the name of the Recherche, was put at his disposal, and he set out, 23rd January, 1827, accompanied by a French agent. The Recherche, after touching at several points in the Pacific, cast anchor before Vanikoro, 7th of July, in 1827, in that same harbor of Vanu where the Nautilus was at this time. There it collected numerous relics of the wreck, iron utensils, anchors, pulley stops, swivel guns, an 18-pound shot, fragments of astronomical instruments, a piece of crownwork, and a bronze clock, bearing an inscription, Mazin Mafate, the mark of the foundry of the arsenal at Brest about 1785. There could be no further doubt. Dillon, having made all inquiries, stayed in the unlucky place till October. Then he quitted Vanikoro and directed his course toward New Zealand and put into Calcutta, 7th April 1828, returning to France, where he was warmly welcomed by Charles X. But at the same time, without knowing Dillon's movements, Dumont d'Urville had already set out to find the scene of the wreck, and they had learned from a whaler that some medals and a cross of St. Louis had been found in the hands of some savages of Louisiade and New Caledonia. Dumont d'Urville, commander of the Astrolabe, had then sailed, and put 2 months after Dillon had left Vanikoro, be put into Hobart Town. There he learned the results of Dillon's inquiries, and found that a certain James Hobbs, second lieutenant of the Union of Calcutta, after landing on an island situated 8 degrees 18 minutes south latitude and 156 degrees 30 minutes east longitude, had seen some iron bars and red stuff used by the natives of these parts. Dumont d'Urville, much perplexed and not knowing how to credit the reports of low-class journals, decided to follow Dillon's track. On the 10th of February, 1828, the astrolabe appeared off Tikopia and took as guide and interpreter a deserter found on the island, made his way to Vanikoro, sighted it on the 12th instance, lay among the reefs until the 14th, and not until the 20th did he cast anchor within the barrier of the harbor of Vanu. On the 23rd, several officers went round the island and brought back some unimportant trifles. The natives, adopting a system of denials and evasions, refused to take them to the unlucky place. This ambiguous conduct led them to believe that the natives had ill-treated the castaways, and indeed they seemed to fear that Dumont d'Urville had come to avenge La Perouse and his unfortunate crew. However, on the 26th, appeased by some presents, and understanding that they had no reprisals to fear, they led Monsieur Jacquereau to the scene of the wreck. There, in 3 or 4 fathoms of water, between the reefs of Pacot and Vanneau, lay anchors, cannons, pigs of lead and iron embedded in limy concretions. The large boat and the whaler belonging to the astrolabe were sent to this place, and not without some difficulty their crews hauled up an anchor weighing 1,800 pounds, a brass gun, some pigs of iron, 2 copper swivel guns beside. Dumont d'Urville, questioning the natives, learned too that La Perouse, after losing both his vessels on the reefs of this island, had constructed a smaller boat, only to be lost a second time. Where, no one knew. But the French government, fearing that Dumont d'Urville was not acquainted with Dillon's movements, had sent the sloop Bayonnaise, commanded by Legarant de Tromelin, to Vanikoro, which had been stationed on the west coast of America. The Bayonnaise cast her anchor before Vanikoro some months after the departure of the astrolabe, but found no new document, but stated that the savages had respected the monument to La Perouse. That is the substance of what I told Captain Nemo. I hope you did it a little more concisely, or Captain Nemo would be standing there for a long time. So, no one knows now where the third vessel perished, that was constructed by the castaways on the island of Vanikoro? No one knows. Captain Nemo said nothing, but signed to me to follow him into the large saloon. The Nautilus sank several yards below the waves, and the panels were opened. I hastened to the aperture, and under the crustaceans of coral covered with fungi, siphonules, alcyons, madrepores, through myriads of charming fish, grielles, glypsidriae, pompherides, diacopes, and holocentras, I recognized certain debris that the drags had not been able to tear up. Iron stirrups, anchors, cannons, bullets, capstan fittings for the stem of a ship, all objects clearly proving the wreck of some vessel, and now carpeted with living flower. While I was looking on this desolate scene, Captain Nemo said in a sad voice, "Commander La Perouse set out 7th of December, 1785, with his vessels La Boussole and the Astrolabe. He first cast anchor at Botany Bay, visited the Friendly Isles, New Caledonia, and then directed his course towards Santa Cruz, and put into Namoka, one of the Hapai group. Then his vessels struck on the unknown reefs of Vanikoro. The Boussole, which went first, ran aground on the southerly coast. The Astrolabe went to its help, and ran aground as well. The first vessel was destroyed almost immediately, and the second, stranded under the wind, resisted for some days. The natives made the castaways welcome. They installed themselves in the island, and constructed a smaller boat with the debris of their 2 large ones. Some sailors stayed willingly at Vanikoro, and the others, weak and ill, set out with La Perouse. They directed their course toward the Solomon Islands, and there perished with everything on the westerly coast of the chief island of the group, between Capes Deception and Satisfaction." "How do you know that?" "By this that I found on the spot where was the last wreck." Captain Nemo showed me a tin plate box, stamped with the French coat of arms, and corroded by the salt water. He opened it, and I saw a bundle of papers, yellow, but still readable. They were the instructions of the naval minister to Commander La Perouse, and annotated in the margin, in Louis the 16th's handwriting. Oh, a fine death for a sailor. A coral tomb makes a quiet grave, and I trust that I and my comrades will find no other. Well, that's kind of dire. Hmm. Hmm. You'll have to excuse me making noise while I drink things. Oh no. Sorry, I just noticed that the handle is chipped uh on my teapot and very likely to break. That makes me very sad. I really like this teapot. Like, let's see if I can get the camera to see this, shall we? So, if we zoom way in and we get autofocus to work right, see there? There's a big chip out of it. I'll post something on Twitter. Uh, I'll post a picture on Twitter in the intermission when we get there. That's really unfortunate. I might actually be able to like squish some epoxy in there and we might be fine. Who knows? I now really need to learn to patch ceramics because I have I have two mugs that I need to patch. I have an old Good Mythical Morning mug of an older design that had a little chip on the rim, and I need to patch that. And I have the pieces of a mug somewhere around here, a large mug that is one of my favorites, despite the design on it being a Harry Potter. You know, it's like it's not. You know, I'm not giving her any more money by continuing to have this mug. Honestly, once I've learned to fix the mug, it'll be more. It'll be more. Huh, look at that time I mended a mug. Than haha, look at my Harry Potter mug. I'm hoping to like try and take a Kirinsugi approach to it, like kind of get some epoxy resin and like dye it a nice color or something, and kind of glue it back together that way. Who knows if it'll actually work? I need to do some learning on that. But now I really need to do some learning on that because my poor teapot's handle is coming apart. It's really unfortunate. Was that just now? What in the world? What? That was just now. Like, okay. You may not be able to see this in my fingies here, but that's a chunk out of the handle. What? Why? I've been treating this so nicely. I don't think I can get that chunk back in there. Well, that's going to sit right there until I figure out where to put it. That's really unfortunate. I really like this teapot. I hope the handle doesn't break. Anyway, now that I've gotten thoroughly distracted by the concept of my teapot potentially breaking. I mean, to be fair, I'm not, like, this teapot is not being, like, this teapot is not in ideal teapot circumstances. Like, the very point of the funnel here has lost a lot of, let's hope I don't pour anything on my computer doing this. The point of the funnel has lost a lot of color because it was rubbing against the cabinet door it's stored in, and but I had it so well packed. I mean, it's not the only thing involved in this teapot that's potentially breaking. You might be able to see it. I don't think, honestly, I don't think you'd be able to see it on camera. Uh, but I can see it. Oh, there's a chip out of the bottom of the plate too. Goodness gracious, I need to find a better place to store my poor ceramics. They're just having a rough day of it. The saucer that the teapot is on has a big spiderweb crack in the bottom and apparently a chip out of the bottom edge, which makes me especially sad. Anyway, apparently I need to learn to patch ceramics because my nice china is going to pieces. I do actually really like this teapot. It matches the color scheme in here, and it's I got it at a thrift store. I like walked past it and I was like, "Ooh, do I need a teapot?" And then I like thought about it for more than 5 seconds and I went, "I do need a teapot. Thank you very much." Anyway, now that I've gotten thoroughly distracted by my poor teapot that's having a rough day, we can dive into chapter 19, Torres Straits. During the night of the 27th to 28th of December, the Nautilus left the shores of Vanikoro with great speed. Her course was southwesterly, and in 3 days she had gone over the 750 leagues that separated it from La Perouse group and the southeast point of Papua. Papa? Papa. Papua? Yeah. The the place that eventually becomes Papua New Guinea. Probably. Early on the 1st of January, 1863, Conseil joined me on the platform. Master, will you permit me to wish you a happy new year? What? Conseil, exactly as if I was at Paris in my study in the Jardin des Plantes. Jardin des Plantes? Well, I accept your good wishes, and thank you for them. Only I'll ask you what you mean by a happy new year under our circumstances. Do you mean the year will bring us to the end of our imprisonment, or the year that sees us to continue this strange voyage? Really, I do not know how to answer, master. We are sure to see curious things, and for the last 2 months we have not had time for dullness. The last marvel is always the most astonishing, and if we continue this progression, I do not know how it will end. It's my opinion that we shall never again see the like. I think, then, with no offence to master, that a happy new year would be one in which we could see everything. On the 2nd January, we had made 11,340 miles, or 5,250 French leagues, since our starting point in the Japan seas. Before the ship's head stretched the dangerous shores of the Coral Sea on the northeast coast of Australia. Our boat lay along some miles from the redoubtable bank on which Cook's vessel was lost, 10th June, 1770. The boat in which Cook was struck on a rock, and if it did not sink, it was owing to a piece of coral that was broken by the shock and fixed itself in the broken keel. I had wished to visit the reef, 360 leagues long, against which the sea, always rough, broke with great violence, with a noise like thunder. But just then the inclined planes drew the Nautilus down to a great depth, and I could see nothing of the high coral walls. I had to content myself with the different specimens of fish brought up by the nets. I remarked, among others, some Germans. Germans? Some Germans, a species of mackerel as large as a tunny, with bluish sides and striped with transverse bands that disappear with the animal's life. These fish followed us in shoals and furnished us with very delicate food. We also took a large number of gilt heads, about 1.5 inches long, tasting like dories, and flying pirapeds like submarine swallows, which in the dark nights light alternately the air and the water with their phosphorescent light. Among the mollusks and zoophytes, I found in the meshes of the net several species of aclocyanarians, achini, hammers, spurs, dials, cerites, and hyaliae. Hyaliae? The flora was represented by beautiful floating seaweeds, Laminariae, and macrocystes, impregnated with the mucilage that transludes through their pores, and among which I gathered an admirable Nemostoma Gilliniarwa, that was classed among the natural curiosities of the museum. 2 days after crossing the Coral Sea, 4th January, we sighted the Papuan coasts. On this occasion, Captain Nemo informed me that his intention was to get into the Indian Ocean by the Strait of Torres, and his communication ended there. The Torres Straits are nearly 34 leagues wide, but they're obstructed by an innumerable quantity of islands, islets, breakers, and rocks that make its navigation almost impracticable, so that Captain Nemo took all needful precautions to cross them. The Nautilus, floating betwixt wind and water, went at a moderate pace. Her screw, like a cetacean's tail, beat the waves slowly. Profiting by this, I and my two companions went on up to the deserted platform. Before us was the steersman's cage, and I expected that Captain Nemo was there, directing the course of the Nautilus. I had before me the excellent charts of the Straits of Taurus, and I consulted them attentively. Round the Nautilus the sea dashed furiously. The course of the waves that went from southeast to northwest at the rate of 2.5 miles broke on the coral that showed itself here and there. "This is a bad sea," remarked Ned Land. "Detestable indeed, one that does not suit a boat like the Nautilus." "The captain must be very sure of his route, for I see there pieces of coral that would do for its keel if it only touched them slightly." And indeed the situation was dangerous, but the Nautilus seemed to slide like magic off these rocks. It did not follow the routes of the Astrolabe and the Zélé exactly, for they proved fatal to Dumont d'Urville. It bore more northwards, coasted the islands of Murray, and came back to the southwest, toward Cumberland Passage. I thought it was going to pass by, when, going back to the northwest, it went through a large quantity of islands and islets little known, toward the Island Sound and Canal Marvois. Marvois? My French pronunciation's not the best, if you couldn't tell. I wondered if Captain Nemo, foolishly imprudent, would steer his vessel into that pass where Dumont d'Urville's two corvettes touched, when, swerving again and cutting straight through to the west, he steered for the island of Gilboa. It was then 3 in the afternoon. The tide began to recede, being quite full. The Nautilus approached the island that I still saw, with its remarkable border of screw pines. He stood off it at about 2 miles distant, and suddenly a shock overthrew me. The Nautilus just touched a rock, and stayed immovable, laying lightly to port side. When I rose, I perceived Captain Nemo and his lieutenant on the platform. They were examining the situation of the vessel, and exchanging words in their incomprehensible dialect. She was situated thus. 2 miles on the starboard side appeared Gilboa, stretching from north to west like an immense arm. Towards the south and east some coral showed itself, left by the ebb. We had run aground, and in one of those seas where the tides are middling, a sorry matter for the floating of the Nautilus. However, the vessel had not suffered, for her keel was solidly joined. But if she could neither glide nor move, she ran the risk of being forever fastened to these rocks, and then Captain Nemo's submarine vessel would be done for. I was reflecting thus when the captain, cool and calm, always a master of himself, approached me. "An accident?" "No, an incident." "But an incident that will oblige you, perhaps, to become an inhabitant of this land from which you flee?" Captain Nemo looked at me curiously and made a negative gesture, as much to say that nothing would force him to set foot on terra firma again. And then he said, "Besides, Monsieur Aronnax, the Nautilus is not lost. It will carry you yet into the midst of the marvels of the ocean. Our voyage is only begun, and I do not wish to be deprived so soon the honor of your company." However, Captain Nemo," I replied, without noticing the ironical turn of his phrase, "the Nautilus has run aground in open sea. The tides aren't strong in the Pacific, and if you cannot lighten the Nautilus, I don't see how it'll be reinflated." "Well, yes, the tides are not strong in the tides are not strong in the Pacific. You're right there, Professor. But in Torres Straits one still finds a difference of 1.5 yards between the level of high and low seas. Today's 4th January, and in 5 days the moon will be full. Now I shall be very much astonished if that satellite does not raise these masses of water sufficiently, and render me a service that I should be indebted to her for." Having said this, Captain Nemo, followed by his lieutenant, redescended to the interior of the Nautilus. As to the vessel, it moved not, and was immovable, as if the coralline polypi had already walled it up with their indestructible cement. "Well, sir?" That wasn't French. "Oh, well, sir?" said Ned Land, who came up to me after the departure of the captain. "Well, friend Ned, we'll wait patiently for the tide on the 9th instant, for it appears that the moon will have the goodness to put it off again." "Really?" "Really." "And this captain is not going to cast anchor at all, since the tide will suffice?" said Conseil simply. The Canadian looked at Conseil and then shrugged his shoulders. Sir, no, wait, this is Ned. Sir, you may believe me when I tell you that this piece of iron will navigate neither on nor under the sea again. It's only fit to be sold for its weight. I think, therefore, that the time has come to part company with Captain Nemo. Friend Ned, I do not despair of this stout Nautilus as you do. In 4 days we shall know what to hold on to the Pacific tides. Besides, flight might be possible if we were inside of English or Provençal coast, but on the Poppin shores it's another thing. It'll be time enough to come to that extremity if the Nautilus doesn't recover itself again, which I look upon as a grave event. But how do they know, at least, how to act circumspectly? There is an island. On island there are trees. Under those trees terrestrial animals. Bears as cutlets and roast beef, to which I would willingly give a trial. In this friend Ned is right, and I agree with him. Could not Master obtain permission from his friend Captain Nemo to put us on land, if only so as to not lose the habit of treading on the solid parts of our planet? I can ask him, but he will refuse. Will Master risk it, and we shall know how to rely on the captain's amiability? To my great surprise, Captain Nemo gave me the permission I asked for, and he gave it very agreeably, without even exacting from me a promise to return to the vessel. But flight across New Guinea might be very perilous, and I should not have counseled Ned Land to attempt it. Better to be a prisoner on board the Nautilus than to fall into the hands of those natives. Gross. At 8, sorry, I'm gonna react like it's gross every time he's like, "Oh, the natives, the savages, they're bad." I'm like, ugh, do not like it at all. Listen, I love this book. I do not like that part. At 8 o'clock, armed with guns and hatchets, we got off the Nautilus. The sea was pretty calm. A slight breeze blew on land. Conseil and I rowing, we sped along quickly, and Ned steered in the straight passage that the breakers left between them. The boat was well handled and moved rapidly. Ned Land couldn't restrain his joy. He was like a prisoner that had escaped from prison and knew that it was necessary to re-enter it. Oh, meat! We're going to eat some real meat, and what meat? Real game, no bread, indeed. I do not say that fish is not good. We must not abuse it, but a piece of fresh venison, grilled on live coals, will agreeably vary our ordinary course. Glutton, he makes my mouth water. It remains to be seen if these forests are full of game, if the game's not such as will hunt the hunter himself, even. Well, Monsieur Aronnax, replied the Canadian, whose teeth seemed sharpened like the edge of a hatchet, I will eat tiger, loin of tiger, if there is no other quadruped on this island. Friend Ned is uneasy about it. Whatever it may be, every animal with 4 paws without feathers, or with 2 paws without feathers, will be saluted by my first shot. Very well. Master Land's imprudences are beginning. Never fear, Monsieur Aronnax. I do not want 25 minutes to offer you a dish of my sort. At 8:30, the Nautilus boat ran softly aground on a heavy sand, after having happily passed the coral reef that surrounds the island of Gilboa. Before we dive into chapter 20, I'm curious, has there been any, like, high-profile adaptation of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea outside of Disney's version? You know, the one with the like, lobster tail looking thing over the green bulb, you know? Uh, the one that the, like, 4 different Nautilus rides that have been at Disney parks over the years are based on. And everybody goes, "Oh man, that's kind of cool. They're just making a thing for the park." But there was actually a 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea movie at some point, kind of produced around the same time as the Black Hole. Like, it's public domain. You would think someone would have taken a shot at it, but you never know. Maybe because Papa Disney has their iron hands around the trademarks, nobody's taking a shot at it. I have no idea. I know Rick Riordan recently took a shot at writing a sort of sequel, sort of thing. I know it's loosely tied to 20,000 Leagues. Like, it involves Captain Nemo's daughter, I think. I haven't read it yet. I assume it's good. It's Rick Riordan. I mean, I haven't not liked anything he's written yet. I have opinions about a lot of things he's written, but I've not liked them. That may be something I get to Google during the intermission, which probably will be after this chapter. Well, this chapter or the next chapter, depending on how long it takes. I have several things I would like to Google, actually. Anyway, now that I've gotten thoroughly distracted, let's dive into chapter 20, A Few Days on Land. I was much impressed on touching land. Ned Land tried the soil with his feet as if to take possession of it. However, it was only 2 months before that we'd become, according to Captain Nemo, passengers on board the Nautilus, but in reality prisoners of its commander. In a few minutes we were within musket shot of the coast. The whole horizon was hidden behind a beautiful curtain of forests. Enormous trees, the trunks of which attained a height of 200 feet, were tied to each other by garlands of bindweed, real natural hammocks, with which a light breeze rocked. There were mimosas, figs, hibiscus, and palm trees mingled together in profusion, and under the shelter of their verdant vault grew orchids, leguminous plants, and ferns. But without noticing all these beautiful specimens of pop and flora, the Canadian abandoned the agreeable for the useful. He discovered a cocoa tree, beat down some of the fruit, broke them, and we drank the milk and ate the nut with a satisfaction that protested against the ordinary food on the Nautilus. Excellent. Exquisite. And I do not think that he would object to introducing a cargo of coconuts on board. I don't think he would, but he wouldn't taste them. So much the worse for him. And so much the better for us. There'll be more for us. One word only, Master Land, when I said to the harpooner, who was beginning to ravage another coconut tree. Coconuts are good things, but before filling the canoe with them, it'd be wise to reconnoitre. Is that a French spelling of reconnaissance? I thought reconnaissance was already a French word. Yeah, I'm going to say reconnaissance. It would be wise to perform some reconnaissance and see if the island did not produce some substance not less useful. Fresh vegetables would be welcome on board the Nautilus. Master is right, and I propose to reserve 3 places in our vessel. One for fruits, the other for vegetables, and the third for venison, which I've not seen yet the smallest specimen. Conseil, we must not despair. Let's continue, and lie in wait. Although the island seems uninhabited, it might still contain some individuals that'd be less hard than we on the nature of game. Oh, said Ned Land, moving his jaws significantly. Well, Ned, my word, I begin to understand the charms of anthropophagy. Ned, what are you saying? You, a man-eater? I shouldn't feel safe with you, especially... Wait, no, this is Conseil. Ned, what are you saying? You, a man-eater? I shouldn't feel safe with you, especially as I share your cabin. I might perhaps wake one day to find myself half devoured. Oh, friend Conseil, I like you much, but not enough to eat you unnecessarily. I wouldn't trust you, but enough. We must absolutely bring down some game to satisfy this cannibal, or else one of these fine mornings Master will find only pieces of his servant to serve him. While we were talking thus, we were penetrating the somber arches. Let's try that again. While we were talking thus, we were penetrating the somber arches of the forest, and for 2 hours we surveyed it in all directions. Chance rewarded our search for eatable vegetables, and one of the most useful products of the tropical zones furnished us with precious food that we missed on board. I would speak of the breadfruit tree, very abundant in the island of Gilboa, and I remarked chiefly the variety destitute of seeds, which bears in Malaya the name of rima. Ned Land knew these fruits well. He'd already eaten many during his numerous voyages, and he knew how to prepare the eatable substance. Moreover, the sight of them excited him, and he could contain himself no longer. Master, Nope, this is Ned. Master, I shall die if I do not taste a little of this breadfruit pie. Taste it, friend Ned. Taste it as you want. We are here to make experiments. Make them. It won't take long. And provided with a lentil, he lighted a fire of dead wood that crackled joyously. During this time, Conseil and I chose the best fruits of the breadfruit. Some had not then attained a significant degree of maturity, and their thick skin covered a white but rather fibrous pulp. Others, the greater number yellow and gelatinous, waited only to be picked. These fruits enclosed no kernel. Conseil brought up a dozen to Ned Land, who placed them on a coal fire after cutting them in thick slices, and while doing this, repeated, "You will see, master, how good this bread is. So more so when one has been deprived of it so long. It's not even bread, but a delicate pastry. You have eaten none, master?" "No, Ned." "Very well. Prepare yourself for a juicy thing. If you do not come for more, I am no longer the king of harpooners." After some minutes, the part of the fruits that was exposed to the fire was completely roasted. The interior looked like a white pastry, a sort of soft crumb, the flavor of which was like that of an artichoke. It must be confessed this bread was excellent, and I ate of it with great relish. What time is it now?" 2 o'clock at least." "How time flies on firm ground." "Let us be off." We returned through the forest and completed our collection by a raid upon the cabbage palms that we gathered from the tops of the trees, little beans that I recognized as the abro of the Malays, and yams of a superior quality. Yams of a superior quality is definitely going on that concept album we mentioned in a recent episode. We were loaded when we reached the boat, but Ned Land did not find his provisions sufficient. Fate, however, favored us. Just as we were pushing off, he perceived several trees from 25 to 30 feet high, a species of palm tree. At last, at 5 o'clock in the evening, loaded with our riches, we quitted the shore, and half an hour after we hailed the Nautilus. No one appeared on our arrival. The enormous iron-plated cylinder seemed deserted. The provisions embarked, I descended to my chamber, and after supper, slept soundly. The next day, 6th January, nothing new on board. Not a sound inside, not a sign of life. The boat rested along the edge in the same place which we'd left it. We resolved to return to the island, and Ned Land hoped to be more fortunate than on the day before with regards to a hunt, and wished to visit another part of the forest. At dawn we set off. The boat, carried on by the waves that flowed to shore, reached the island in a few minutes. We landed, thinking that it was better to give in to the Canadian. We followed Ned Land, whose long limbs threatened to distance us. He wound up the coast toward the west, and fording some torrents, he gained the high plain that was bordered with admirable forests. Some kingfishers were rambling upon the watercourses, but they would not let themselves be approached. Their circumspection proved to me that these birds knew what to expect from bipeds of our species, and I concluded that if the island was not inhabited, at least human beings occasionally frequented it. After crossing a rather large prairie, we arrived at the skirts of a little wood that was enlivened by the songs and flight of a large number of birds. "They were only birds." "But they are eatable." "I don't agree with you, friend Ned. I only see parrots here." Rather, that was Conseil. "I don't agree with you, friend Ned. There are only parrots here." Friend Conseil, if parrot is like pheasant to those who have nothing else. And this bird, suitably prepared, is worth a knife and fork." Indeed, under the thick foliage of this wood, a world of parrots were flying from branch to branch, only needing a careful education to speak the human language. For the moment they were chattering with parrots of all colors, and grave cockatoos who seemed to meditate upon some philosophical problem, while brilliant red lories passed by like a piece of bunting carried away by the breeze, poppins with the finest azure colors, and in all a variety of winged things most charming to behold, but few eatable. However, a bird peculiar to these lands, and which has never passed the limit of the Arrow and Poppin Islands, was wanting in this collection, but fortune reserved it for me before long. After passing through a moderately thick copse. Sorry, I was trying to remember if that one you pronounce that differently. Anyway, we found a plain obstructed with bushes. I saw then those magnificent birds, the disposition of whose long feathers obliges them to fly against the wind. Their undulating flight, graceful aerial curves, and the shading of their colors attracted and charmed one's looks. I had no trouble in recognizing them. Birds of paradise! You know, those things that give you mana and magic. The Malays, who carry on a great trade in these birds with the Chinese, have several means that we could not employ for taking them. Sometimes they put snares on the top of high trees that birds of paradise prefer to frequent. Sometimes they catch them with a vicious bird lime that paralyzes their movements. They even go so far as to poison the fountains that the birds generally drink from, but we were obliged to fire at them during flight, which gave us few chances to bring them down, and indeed we vainly exhausted half of our ammunition. About 11 o'clock in the morning, the first range of mountains that formed the center of the island was traversed, and we had killed nothing. Hunger drove us on, and the hunters relied on the products of the chase, and they were wrong. Happily, Conseil, to his great surprise, made a double shot and secured breakfast. He brought down a white pigeon and a wood pigeon, which, cleverly plucked and suspended from a skewer, was roasted before a red fire of dead wood. While these interesting birds were cooking, Ned prepared the fruit of the bread tree. Then the wood pigeons were devoured to the bones and declared excellent. The nutmeg with which they are in the habit of stuffing their crops flavors their flesh and renders it delicious eating. Now, Ned, what do you miss now? Some four-footed game, Monsieur Arnold's. All these pigeons are only side dishes, trifles. Until I've killed an animal with cutlets, I shall not be content. Nor I, Ned, if I don't catch a bird of paradise. Let us continue hunting. Let us go toward the sea. We've arrived at the first declivities of the mountains. I think we'd better regain the region of forests. That was sensible advice, and followed out. After walking for an hour, we had attained a forest of sago trees. Some inoffensive serpents glided away from us. Inoffensive serpents, also a good band name. Two of the band members have suddenly split off to form the band Inoffensive Serpents. The birds of paradise fled at our approach, and truly I despaired of getting near one when Conseil, who was walking in front, suddenly bent down and uttered a triumphal cry, coming back to me bearing a magnificent specimen. "Oh, bravo, Conseil!" "Master is very good." "No, my boy, you've made an excellent stroke. Take one of these living birds and carry it in your hand." "If master will examine it, he'll see that I have not deserved great merit." "Why, Conseil?" "This bird's drunk as a quail." "Drunk?" "Yes, sir, drunk with the nutmegs it devoured under the nutmeg tree, under which I found it. See, friend Ned, see the monstrous effects of intemperance." "Oh, by Jove, because I've drunk gin for 2 months, you need to reproach me." However, I examined the curious bird, and Conseil was quite right. The bird, drunk with the juice, was quite powerless. It couldn't fly, it could hardly walk. This bird belonged to the most beautiful of the 8 species that are found in Papua and in the neighboring islands. It was the large emerald bird, the most rare kind. It measured 3 feet in length, and its head was comparatively small, its eyes placed near the opening of the beak, and also small. But the shades of color were beautiful, having a yellow beak, brown feet and claws, nut-colored wings with purple tips, pale yellow at the back of the neck and head, and the emerald-colored throat, chestnut on the breast and belly. 2 horned downy nets rose from below the tail. It prolonged the long, light feathers of admirable fineness, and they completed the whole of this marvelous bird that the natives have poetically named the bird of the sun. But if my wishes were satisfied by the possession of the bird of paradise, the Canadians were not yet. Happily, about 2 o'clock, Ned Land brought down a magnificent hog from the brood of those the natives called barioton. The animal came in time for us to procure real quadruped meat, and he was well received. Ned Land was very proud of his shot. The hog, hit by the electric ball, fell stone dead. The Canadians skinned and cleaned it properly after having taken a half a dozen cutlets, destined to furnish us with a grilled repast in the evening. Then the hunt was resumed, which was still more marked by Ned and Conseil's exploits. Indeed, the 2 friends, beating the bushes, roused a herd of kangaroos that fled and bounded upon their elastic paws. But these animals did not take to flight so rapidly, but what the electric capsule could stop their course. "Ja, Professor, cried Ned Land, who was carried away by the delights of the chase. What excellent game, and stewed too. What a supply for the Nautilus. 2, 3, 5 now. And to think that we shall eat the flesh, and the idiots on board shall not have a crumb. I think that in the excess of his joy, if the Canadian had not talked so much, would have killed them all. But he contented himself with a single dozen of these interesting marsupials. These animals were small. They were a species of those kangaroo rabbits that live habitually in the hollows of trees, and whose speed is extreme, but they're moderately fat, and furnish at least estimable food. We were very satisfied with the results of the hunt. Happy Ned proposed to return to this enchanting island the next day, for he wished to depopulate it of all the eatable quadrupeds. But he had reckoned without his host. At 6 o'clock in the evening we had regained the shore. Our boat was moored to the usual place, and the Nautilus, like a long rock, emerged from the waves 2 miles from the beach. Ned Land, without waiting, occupied himself about the important dinner business. He understood all about cooking well. The barioton, grilled on the coals, soon scented the air with a delicious odor. And indeed the dinner was excellent. 2 wood pigeons completed this extraordinary menu. The sago patsi, the atrocarpus bread, some mangoes, half a dozen pineapples, and the liquor fermented from some coconuts overjoyed us. I even think that my worthy companion's ideas had not all the plainness desirable. Suppose we do not return to the Nautilus this evening? Suppose we never return? Just then a stone fell at our feet and cut short the harpooner's proposition. Oh, as much as I want to leave on, as much as I want to go to BRB on that, that particular cliffhanger, I think I've got one more chapter in me. Chapter 21. Captain Nemo's Thunderbolt. We looked at the edge of the forest without rising, my hand stopping in the action of putting it to my mouth, Ned Land's completing its office. Stones do not fall from the sky, or they'd merit the name aerolites. A second stone, carefully aimed, that made a savory pigeon leg fall from Conseil's hand, gave more weight to his observation. We all 3 arose, shouldered our guns, and were ready to reply to any attack. Are they apes? Very nearly. They're savages. Gross. To the boat, I said, hurrying to the sea. It was indeed necessary to beat a retreat, for about 20 natives, armed with bows and slings, appeared on the skirts of a copse that masked the horizon to the right, hardly 100 steps from us. Our boat was moored about 60 feet from us, and the natives approached us, not running, but making hostile demonstrations. Stones and arrows fell thickly. Ned Land had not wished to leave his provisions, and in spite of his imminent danger, his pig on one side and kangaroos on the other, he went tolerably fast. In 2 minutes we were on the shore. To load the boat with provisions and arms, to push out to sea and ship the oars was the work of an instant. We had not gone 2 cable lengths when 100 natives, howling and gesticulating, entered the water up to their waists. I wanted to see if their apparition would attract some men from the Nautilus on the platform, but no, the enormous machine, lying off, was absolutely deserted. 20 minutes later we were on board. The panels were open. After making the boat fast, we entered into the interior of the Nautilus. I descended to the drawing room, from whence I heard some chords. Captain Nemo was there, bending over his organ, and plunged in a musical ecstasy. "Captain!" He didn't hear me. "Captain!" I said, touching his hand. He shuddered, and turning round, said, "Oh, is it you, Professor? Well, have you had a good hunt? Have you botanized successfully?" "Yes, Captain, but unfortunately we've brought a troop of bipeds whose vicinity troubles me." "What bipeds?" "Natives." "Natives?" he echoed ironically. "So you're astonished, Professor, at having set foot on a strange land and finding someone natively there?" "Natives where there are not any. Besides, are they worse than others, those whom you call savages?" "Captain, how many have you counted?" 100 at least." Monsieur Aronnax, replied Captain Nemo, placing his fingers on the organ stops. When all the natives of Papa are assembled on the shore, the Nautilus will have nothing to fear from their attacks. The captain's fingers were then running over the keys of the instrument, and I remarked that he only touched the black keys, which gave his melodies an essentially Scotch character. Soon he had forgotten my presence, and plunged into a reverie that I didn't disturb. I went up again onto the platform. Night had already fallen, for in this low latitude the sun sets rapidly, without twilight. I could only see the island indistinctly, but the numerous fires lighted on the beach showed that the natives of this place did not think of leaving it. I was alone for several hours, sometimes thinking of the natives without any dread of them, for the imperturbable confidence of the captain was catching me, sometimes forgetting them to admire the splendors of the night in the tropics. My remembrances went to France and the train of those zodiacal stars which would shine in some hours' time. The moon shone in the midst of the constellation of the zenith. The night slipped away without any mischance, the islanders frightened, no doubt, at the sight of a monster aground in the bay. The panels were open, and could have offered an easy access to the interior of the Nautilus. At 6 o'clock in the morning of the 8th January, I went up onto the platform. The dawn was breaking, and the island soon showed itself through the dissipating fogs. First the shore, then the summits. The natives were there, more numerous than on the day before, 500 or 600 perhaps. Some of them, profiting by the low water, had come onto the coral at less than 2 cable lengths from the Nautilus. I distinguished them easily. They were true Papuans, with athletic figures, men of good race, large high foreheads, large but not broad and flat, and white teeth. Their woolly hair with a reddish tinge showed off on their shining bodies like those of the Nubians. I don't like this description, but I have to keep reading it. From the lobes of their ears, cut and distended, hung chaplets of bones. Most of these people were naked. Amongst them I remarked some women dressed from the hips to the knees in quite a crinoline of herbs that sustained a vegetable waistband. Some chiefs had ornamented their necks with a crescent and collars of glass beads, red and white. Nearly all of them were armed with bows, arrows, shields. They carried on their shoulders a sort of net containing those round stones which they cast from their slings with great skill. One of these chiefs, rather near to the Nautilus, examined it attentively. He was perhaps a Mado of high rank, for he was draped in a mat of banana leaves, notched round the edges and set off with brilliant colors. I could have easily knocked down this native who was within a short length, but I thought it was better to wait for real hostile demonstrations. Between Europeans and native, it's proper for the Europeans to parry, not to attack. During low water, the natives roamed about near the Nautilus, but were not troublesome. I heard them frequently repeat the word "assai," and by their gestures I understood that they invited me to go on land, an invitation that I declined. So that on that day the boat did not push off, to the great displeasure of Master Land, who could not complete his provision. The adroit Canadian employed his time in preparing the viands and meat that he had brought off the island. As for the natives, they returned to the shore about 11 o'clock in the morning, as soon as the coral tops began to disappear under their rising tide, but I saw their numbers had increased considerably on the shore. Probably they came from neighboring islands, or very likely from Papa. However, I had not seen a single canoe. Having nothing better to do, I thought of dragging these beautiful limpid waters, under which I saw a profusion of shells, zoophytes, and marine plants. Moreover, it was in the last day that the Nautilus would pass in these parts, if it flowed in the open sea the next day, according to Captain Nemo's promise. I therefore called Conseil, who brought me a little light drag, very like those for the oyster fishery. Now to work. For 2 hours we fished unceasingly, but without bringing up any rarities. The drag was filled with Midas ears, harps, melimes, and particularly the most beautiful hammers I've ever seen. We also brought up some sea slugs, pearl oysters, a dozen little turtles that were reserved for the pantry on board. But just when I expected it least, I put my hand on a wonder, I might say a natural deformity that was very rarely met with. Conseil was just dragging, and his net came up filled with divers ordinary shells, when all at once he saw me plunge my arm quickly into the net to draw out a shell, and heard me utter a cry. "What's the matter, sir? Has master been bitten?" No, my boy, but I willingly would have given a finger for this discovery. What discovery? This shell. I held up the object of my triumph. It's simply an olive porphyry, genus olive, order of the Pectinibranchidae, class of gasteropods, subclass mollusca. Well, yes, Conseil, but instead of being rolled from right to left, this olive turns from left to right. Is it possible? Yes, my boy. It's a left shell. Shells are all right-handed, with rare exceptions, and when by chance their spiral is left, amateurs are ready to pay their weight in gold. Conseil and I were absorbed in the contemplation of our treasure, and I was promising myself to enrich the museum with it when a stone unfortunately thrown by a native struck against and broke the precious object in Conseil's hand. I uttered a cry of despair, and Conseil took up his gun and aimed at the native who was poising his sling 10 yards from him. I would have stopped him, but his blow took effect and broke the bracelet of amulets which encircled the arm of the savage. Conseil! Conseil! Well, sir, did you not see that savage commenced an attack? A shell's not worth the life of a man. Oh, the scoundrel! I'd rather he'd broken my shoulder. Conseil was in earnest, but I was not of his opinion. However, the situation had changed some minutes before, and we had not perceived it. A score of canoes surrounded the Nautilus. These canoes, scooped out of the trunk of a tree, long, narrow, well adapted for speed, were balanced by means of a long bamboo pole which floated on the water. They were managed by skillful paddlers, and I watched their advance with some unease. It was evident that these Poppins had already had dealings with the Europeans and knew their ships. But this long iron cylinder anchored in the bay, without masts or chimneys, what could they think of it? Nothing good, for at least at first they kept at a respectful distance. However, seeing it motionless, by degrees they took courage and sought to familiarize themselves with it. Now this familiarity was precisely what it was necessary to avoid. Our arms, which were noiseless, could only produce a moderate effect on the natives, who have little respect for aught but blustering things. The thunderbolt without the reverberations of thunder would frighten man but little, though the danger lies in the lightning, not the noise. At this moment the canoes approached the Nautilus, and a shower of arrows alighted on her. I went down to the saloon and found no one there. I ventured to knock at the door that was open into the captain's room. "Come in," was the answer. I entered, and found Captain Nemo deep in algebraical calculations of x and other quantity. I'm disturbing you." "That's true, Monsieur Aronnax, but I think you have serious reasons for wishing to see me." "Very grave ones. The natives are surrounding us in their canoes, and in a few minutes will certainly be attacked by many hundreds of savages." "Oh, are they coming with their canoes?" "Yes, sir." "Well, sir, we must close the hatches." "Exactly, and I came to say to you—" "Nothing can be more simple," said Captain Nemo, and he pressed a button and transmitted an order to the ship's crew. "It's done, sir," he said after some moments. "The pinnace is ready and the hatches are closed. You do not fear, I imagine, that these gentlemen can stave in walls on which the balls of your frigate had no effect?" "No, but a danger still exists, Captain." "What's that, sir?" "It is that tomorrow, at about this hour, we have to open the hatches to renew the air of the Nautilus. At this moment, if the Poppins should occupy the platform, I don't see how you could prevent them from entering." "Then do you suppose they'll board us?" "I'm certain of it." "Well, let them come. I see no reason for hindering them. After all, these Poppins are poor creatures. I'm unwilling that my visit to the island should cost the life of a single one of these people." Oh, that sentence took a hard turn right in the middle of it. I was like, yeah, he's not gonna mind the native people showing up, and then he's like, "Oh, they are wretched. I need to give them civilization." I'm like, oh, no, no. Anyway, modern man cringes about historically accurate text. Upon that I was going away, but Captain Nemo detained me and asked me to sit down by him. He questioned me with interest about our excursions on shore and our hunting, seemed not to understand the craving for meat that possessed the Canadian. Then the conversation turned on various subjects, and without being more communicative, Captain Nemo showed himself a bit more amicable. Amongst other things, we happened to speak of the situation of the Nautilus, run aground in exactly the same spot in this strait where Dumont d'Urville was nearly lost. And apropos of this, this d'Urville was one of your great sailors, one of your most intelligent navigators. He is the Captain Cook of you Frenchmen, so I'm told. Unfortunate man of science, after having braved the icebergs of the South Pole, the coral reefs of Oceania, the cannibals of the Pacific, to perish miserably in a railway train. If this energetic man could have reflected during the last moments of his life, what would have been uppermost in his last thoughts, do you suppose? So speaking, Captain Nemo seemed moved, and his emotion gave me a better opinion of him. Then, chart in hand, we reviewed the travels of the French navigator, his voyages of circumnavigation, his double detention at the South Pole, which led to the discovery of Adelaide and Louis Philippe, and fixing the hydrographical bearings of the principal islands of Oceania. That which d'Urville has done on the surface of the seas, that I've done under them, and more easily, more completely than him. The Astrolabe of the Zélé, incessantly tossed about by the hurricane, could not be worth the Nautilus, quiet repository of labor that she is, truly motionless in the midst of the water. "Tomorrow," said the captain, rising, "tomorrow at 20 minutes to 3 p.m. the Nautilus shall float and leave the Strait of Taurus uninjured." Having curtly pronounced these words, Captain Nemo bowed slightly to dismiss me, and I went back to my room. There I found Conseil, who wished to know the result of my interview with the captain. My boy, when I feigned to believe that his Nautilus was threatened by the natives of Papa, the captain answered me very sarcastically. I have but one thing to say to you. Have confidence in him, and go to sleep in peace. Have you no need of my services, sir? No, my friend. What's Ned Land up to? If you'll excuse me, sir, friend Ned is busy making a kangaroo pie, which should be a marvel. I remained alone and went to bed, but slept indifferently. I heard the noise of the natives who stamped on the platform, uttering deafening cries. The night passed thus, without disturbing the ordinary repose of the crew. The presence of these cannibals affected them no more than the soldiers of a masked battery care for the ants that crawl over its front. At 6 in the morning I rose. The hatches had not been opened. The inner air was not renewed, but the reservoirs, filled ready for any emergency, were now resorted to, and discharged several cubic feet of oxygen into the exhausted atmosphere of the Nautilus. I worked in my room till noon without having seen Captain Nemo even for an instant. On board, no preparations for departure were visible. I waited still some time, and then went into the large saloon. The clock marked 2:30. In 10 minutes it would be high tide, and if Captain Nemo had not made a rash promise, the Nautilus would be immediately detached. If not, many months would pass ere she could leave her bed of coral. However, some warning vibrations began to be felt in the vessel. I heard the keel grating against the rough calcareous bottom of the coral reef. At 5:20 to 3, Captain Nemo appeared in the saloon. "We are going to start," said he. "Oh." I've given the order to open the hatches." "And the poppets?" "The poppets?" "Will they not come inside the Nautilus?" "How?" "By leaping over the hatches you've opened." "Monsieur Aronnax, they will not enter the hatches of the Nautilus in that way, even if they were open." I looked at the captain. "You do not understand." "Hardly." "Well, come and you'll see." I directed my steps toward the central staircase, where Ned Land and Conseil were slyly watching some of the ship's crew who were opening the hatches, while cries of rage and fearful vociferations resounded outside. The port lids were pulled down outside. 20 horrible faces appeared, but the first native who placed his hand on the stair rail, struck from behind by some invisible force, I know what not, fled, uttering the most fearful cries and making the wildest contortions. 10 of his companions followed him, and they met with the same fate. Conseil was in ecstasy. Ned Land, carried away by his violent instincts, rushed onto the staircase, but the moment he seized the rail with both hands, he in his turn was overthrown. "I am struck by a thunderbolt."
cried he with an oath. This explained it all. It was no rail, but a metallic cable, charged with electricity from the deck communicating with the platform. Whoever touched it felt a powerful shock, and the shock must have been mortal if would have been mortal if Captain Nemo had discharged into the conductor the whole force of the current. It might truly be said that between his assailants and himself he had stretched a network of electricity which none could pass with impunity. Meanwhile, the exasperated Poppins had beaten a retreat paralyzed with terror. As for us, half laughing, we consoled and rubbed the unfortunate dead land, who swore like someone possessed. But at this moment the Nautilus, raised by the last waves of the tide, quitted her coral bed at exactly the 40th minute fixed by the captain. Her screw swept the waters slowly and majestically, her speed increasing gradually, and, sailing on the surface of the ocean, she quitted safe and sound the dangerous passes of the Straits of Torres. Okay, before we dive into chapter 22, I believe it's time for a little break. So, now is a great time to get up and stretch if you've been listening the whole time. Even if you haven't been listening the whole time, maybe treat yourself to a little stretch. Muscle tension sneaks up on you. Get some water, take any necessary medications if you've got that kind of thing. It's probably where I'm at. It's a good time of night to do that. Maybe give your animals some love. All the standard things you would do in an intermission if a movie had an intermission. Which, if we're gonna keep doing movies as long as they are, we really need to bring back the intermission. Hey, it's Aloriana. Hello. You have joined us just in time for the dulcet tones of royalty-free music because it's break time. I will be back in about 15 minutes at most. I have enough water in here right now, thankfully, so it's just gonna be oh, excuse me. It is just gonna be me activating the kettle. So let me cue up the BRB music here, and we will be right back. Because, you know, some of that's kind of charming, some of that's like, oh, blah, 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 blah. You know? So, definitely worth improving that portion of the stream. If it didn't take me 1,000 years to write any music, I'd just do it myself. I'd just sit at a piano and noodle. Honestly, I might still do that. I might just sit at a piano and just noodle for a while and just let it play, warts and all. You know? Just kind of yuts around, finding and not finding a melody for a while. And not even chop it up. Or maybe just chop it into like 15-minute segments. I don't know. It's a thought. I have a lot of those. Which ones actually make it to the stream? It's not exactly clear. Anyway. Oh, no. Maybe if I stretch hard enough, it will distract me from the concept of having hiccups enough that I just don't anymore. You will have to excuse me if I get a little hiccupy. I forgot to do something. Make sure the warm blanket fits. I forgot the most vital part of doing a BRB from stream, and that's giving the boys, my dear sweet kiddo cats, some love. I also restarted the heated blanket so that while I'm rattling on over here, they don't get cold. Because I love them very much. Yeah, I'm talking about you too. They're looking at me like, don't tell the internet about us, Dad. Anyway, now that I've gotten thoroughly distracted, let me make sure I have the little thing that tells me about my alerts open. And then we can get started. Yep. Okay. Let us continue. Chapter 22. Aegri Somnia. Aegri Somnia? Sorry, that looks Latin. Aegri Somnia. The following day, the 10th of January, the Nautilus continued her course between two seas, but with such remarkable speed, I couldn't estimate it at less than 35 miles an hour. The rapidity of her screw was such that I could neither follow nor count its revolutions. When I reflected that this marvelous electric agent, after having afforded motion, heat, and light to the Nautilus, still protected her from outward attack and transformed her into an ark of safety, which no profane hand might touch without being thunder-stricken, my admiration was unbounded, and from the structure it extended to the engineer who had called it into existence. Oh, yeah, Kitty, if you're gonna be over here, you should probably hop up onto my lap so you're not chilly. Sound good? Sorry, library's being very sassy off camera. Come here, man. Come on. I'll even scooch back a little bit. No? Okay, fine. Sit on the cold floor. Whatever you want. Our course was directed to the west, and on the 11th of January we doubled Cape Vessel, situation in 135 degrees longitude and 10 degrees south latitude, which forms the east point of the Gulf of Carpentaria. The reefs were still numerous, but more equalized, and marked on the chart with extreme precision. The Nautilus easily avoided the breakers of money to the port, and the Victoria Reefs on the starboard, placed at 130 degrees longitude, and on the 10th parallel, which we strictly followed. On the 13th of January, Captain Nemo arrived in the Sea of Timor and recognized the island of that name in 122 degrees longitude. From this point, the direction of the Nautilus inclined toward the southwest. Her head was set for the Indian Ocean. Where would the fancy of Captain Nemo carry us next? Would he return to the coast of Asia, or would he approach again the shores of Europe? Improbable conjectures both, to a man who fled from inhabited continents. Then would he descend to the south? Was he going to double the Cape of Good Hope, then Cape Horn, then finally go as far as the Antarctic Pole? Would he come back at last to the Pacific, where his Nautilus could sail free and independently? Time would show. After having skirted the sands of Cartier, of Hibernia, Appetum, and Scott, last efforts of the solid against the liquid element, on the 14th of January we lost sight of land altogether. The speed of the Nautilus was considerably abated, and with irregular course she sometimes swam in the bosoms of the waters, sometimes floated on their surface. During this period of the voyage, Captain Nemo made some interesting experiments on the varied temperature of the sea in different beds. Under ordinary conditions, these observations are made by means of somewhat complicated instruments and with rather doubtful results. By means of thermometrical sounding leads, the glasses often breaking under the pressure of the water, or an apparatus grounded on the variations of the resistance of metals to electric currents. Results so obtained could not be correctly calculated. On the contrary, Captain Nemo went himself to test the temperature in the depths of the sea, and his thermometer, placed in communication with the different sheets of water, gave him the required degree immediately and accurately. It was thus that by overloading her reservoirs or descending obliquely by means of her inclined planes, the Nautilus successfully attained the depth of 3, 4, 5, 7, 10,000 yards, and the definite result of this experience was that the sea preserved an average temperature of 4 degrees and a half at a depth of 5,000 fathoms under all latitudes. On the 16th of January the Nautilus seemed becalmed only a few yards beneath the surface of the waves. Her electric apparatus remained inactive, and her motionless screw left her to drift at the mercy of the currents. I suppose that the crew was occupied with interior repairs rendered necessary by the violence of the mechanical movements of the machine. My companions and I then witnessed a curious spectacle. The hatches of the saloon were open, and as in the beacon light of the Nautilus was not in action, a dim obscurity reigned in the midst of the waters. I observed the state of the sea under these conditions, and the largest fish appeared to me no more than scarcely defined shadows, when the Nautilus found herself suddenly transported into full light. I thought at first that the beacon had been lighted, and was casting its electric radiance at a liquid mass. I was mistaken, and after a rapid survey perceived my error. The Nautilus floated in the midst of a phosphorescent bed, which, in this obscurity, became quite dazzling. It was produced by myriads of luminous animalcula, whose brilliancy was increased as they glided over the metallic hull of the vessel. I was surprised by lightning in the midst of these luminous sheets, as though they had been rivulets of lead melted in an ardent furnace, or metallic masses brought to a white heat, so that by force of contrast certain portions of light appeared to cast a shade in the midst of the general ignition, from which all shades seemed vanished. No, this wasn't the calm irradiation of our ordinary lighting. This was unusual life and vigor. This was truly living light. In reality, it was an infinite agglomeration of colored infusoria, of veritable globules of jelly, provided with a thread-like tentacle, and of as many as 25,000 had been counted in less than 2 cubic half-inches of water. During these several hours, the Nautilus floated in these brilliant waves, and our admiration increased as we watched the marine monsters disporting themselves like salamanders. I saw there in the midst of this fire that burns not the swift and elegant porpoise, the indefatigable clown of the ocean, and some swordfish 10 feet long, these prophetic heralds of the hurricane, whose formidable sword would now and then strike the glass of the saloon. Then appeared the smaller fish, the ballista, the leaping mackerel, wolf-thorn tails, and 100 others, which striped the luminous atmosphere as they swam. This dazzling spectacle was enchanting. Perhaps some atmospheric condition increased the intensity of this phenomenon. Perhaps some storm agitated the surface of the waves, but at this depth of some yards the Nautilus was unmoved by its fury and reposed peacefully in still water. So we progressed, incessantly charmed by some new marvel. The days passed rapidly away, and I took no account of them. Ned, according to habit, tried to vary the diet on board. Like snails, we were fixed to our shells, and I declare it is easy to lead a snail's life. A Snail's Life is another one of those tracks on that concept album, for sure. It's kind of like a slow thing. Honestly. just take all of the song ideas we've been mentioning in reading this book and just actually try to write them, make them my PRP music. That would be really cute, actually. Thus this life seemed easy and natural, and we thought no longer of the life we led on land, but something happened to recall us to the strangeness of our situation. On the 18th of January, the Nautilus was in 105 degrees longitude and 15 degrees south latitude. The weather was threatening, the sea rough and rolling. There was a strong east wind. The barometer, which had been going down for some days, foreboded a coming storm. I went on up to the platform just as the second lieutenant was taking the measure of the horary angles, and waited, according to habit, until the daily phrase was said. But on this day it was exchanged for another phrase not less incomprehensible. Almost directly, I saw Captain Nemo appear with a glass, looking toward the horizon. For some minutes he was immovable without taking his eye off the point of observation. Then he lowered his glass and exchanged a few words with his lieutenant. The latter seemed to be a victim to some emotion that he tried in vain to repress. Captain Nemo, having more command over himself, was cool. He seemed, too, to be making some objections, to which the lieutenant replied by formal assurances. At least I concluded so by the difference of their tones and gestures. For myself, I looked carefully in the direction indicated without seeing anything. The sky and water were lost in the clear line of the horizon. However, Captain Nemo walked from one end of the platform to the other, without looking at me, perhaps without even seeing me. His step was firm, but less regular than his usual. He stopped sometimes, crossed his arms, and observed the sea. What could he be looking for on that vast expanse? The Nautilus was then some hundreds of miles from the nearest coast. The lieutenant had taken up the glass and examined the horizon steadfastly, going and coming, stamping his foot, and showing more nervous agitation than his superior officer. Besides, this mystery must necessarily be solved, and before long, for upon an order from Captain Nemo the engine, increasing its propelling power, made the screw turn more rapidly. Just then the lieutenant drew the captain's attention again. The latter stopped walking and directed his glass toward the place indicated, and he looked for a long while. I felt very much puzzled, and descended to the drawing-room, and took out an excellent telescope that I generally used. Then, leaning on the cage of the watchlight that jutted out from the front of the platform, set myself to look over all the line of the sky and sea. But my eye was no sooner applied to the glass than it was quickly snatched out of my hands. I turned round. Captain Nemo was before me, but I didn't know it. His face was transfigured, his eyes flashed sullenly, his teeth were set, his stiff body, clenched fists, and head shrunk between his shoulders, betrayed the violent agitation that pervaded his whole frame. He didn't move, and my glass, fallen from his hands, had rolled at his feet. Had I unwittingly provoked this fit of anger? Did this incomprehensible person imagine that I had discovered some forbidden secret? No, I was not the object of his hatred. He wasn't looking at me. His eye was steadily fixed upon the impenetrable point of the horizon. At last Captain Nemo recovered himself. His agitation subsided, and he addressed some words in a foreign language to his lieutenant, and then turned to me. "Monsieur Aronnax," he said in a rather imperious tone, "I require you to keep one of the conditions that bind you to me." "What is it, Captain?" "You must be confined with your companions until I think fit to release you." "You're the master," I replied, looking steadily at him. "But may I ask you one question?" "None, sir." There was no resisting this imperious command. It would have been useless. I went down to the cabin occupied by Ned Land and Conseil, and told them the captain's determination. You may judge how this communication was received by the Canadian. But there wasn't time for altercation, for the crew waited at the door and conducted us to that cell where we'd passed our first night on board the Nautilus. Ned Land would have remonstrated, but the door was shut upon him. "Will master tell me what this means?" I told my companions what had passed. They were as much as astonished as I, and I was equally at a loss as to how to account for it. Meanwhile, I was absorbed in my own reflections and could think of nothing but the strange fear depicted in the captain's countenance. I was utterly at a loss to account for it, and when my cogitations were disturbed by these words from Ned Land. "Hallo, the breakfast is ready." And indeed, the table was laid. Evidently, Captain Nemo had given this order at the same time he'd hastened the speed of the Nautilus. "Will master permit me to make a recommendation?" "Yes, my boy." "Well, it is that the master breakfast. It's prudent, for we do not know what may happen." "You're right, Conseil." "Unfortunately, they have only given us the ship's fare." "Friend Ned, what would you have said if the breakfast had been entirely forgotten?" And this argument cut short the harpooner's recriminations. We sat down at table, and the meal was eaten in silence. Just then the luminous globe that lighted the cell went out and left us in total darkness. Ned Land was soon asleep, and what astonished me was that Conseil went off into a heavy slumber as well. I was thinking what could have caused his irresistible drowsiness when I felt my brain becoming stupefied. In spite of my efforts to keep my eyes open, they'd close. A painful suspicion seized me. Evidently, soporific substances had been mixed with the food we'd just taken. Imprisonment was not enough to conceal Captain Nemo's projects from us. Sleep was more necessary. I then heard the panels shut. The undulations of the sea, which caused a slight rolling motion, ceased. Had the Nautilus quitted the surface of the ocean? Had it gone back to the motionless bed of water? I tried to resist sleep, but it was impossible. My breathing weakened. I felt a mortal cold freeze my stiffened and half-paralyzed limbs. My eyelids, like leaden caps, fell over my eyes. I couldn't raise them. A morbid sleep, full of hallucinations, bereft me of my being. And then the visions disappeared, and left me in complete insensibility. Ooh, we're getting dramatic over here. Just what's going on while our intrepid heroes are asleep? Why is Captain Nemo so bent out of shape? We gotta find out. And the only way to find out is to read more by jumping into chapter 23, The Coral Kingdom. But before I do, I need to make sure the library isn't causing problems. Okay, problems averted. Let's go. Chapter 23. The next day I woke with my head singularly clear. To my great surprise, I was in my own room. My companions, no doubt, had been reinstated in their cabin without having perceived it any more than I. What had passed during the night they were as ignorant as I was, and to penetrate this mystery I only reckoned upon the chances of the future. I then thought of quitting my room. Was I free again, or was I a prisoner? Quite free. I opened the door, went to the half-deck, shut up the central stairs, and the panels that were closed the evening before were open. I went on to the platform. Ned Land and Conseil waited there for me. Despite my questioning, they knew nothing. Lost in a heavy sleep which they'd been totally unconscious, they'd been astonished at finding themselves in their cabin. As for the Nautilus, it seemed quiet and mysterious as ever. It floated on the surface of the waves at a moderate pace. Nothing seemed changed on board. The second lieutenant then came on the platform and gave the usual order below. And as for Captain Nemo, he didn't appear. Of the people on board, I only saw the impassive steward, who served me with his usual mute regularity. About 2 o'clock, I was in the drawing-room, busied in arranging my notes, when the captain opened the door and appeared. I bowed, and he made a slight inclination in return, without speaking. I resumed my work, hoping that he would perhaps give me some explanation of the events of the preceding night. However, he made none. I looked at him. He seemed fatigued. His heavy eyes had not been refreshed by sleep. His face looked very sorrowful. He walked to and fro, sat down, got up again, took a chance book, put it down, consulted his instruments without taking habitual notes, seemed very restless and uneasy. At last he came up to me and said, "Are you a doctor, Monsieur Aronnax?" I so little expected such a question, I stared some time at him without answering. "Are you a doctor? Several of your colleagues have studied medicine." Well, I'm a doctor, a resident surgeon of the hospital. I practiced several years before entering the museum.
Very well, sir.
My answer had evidently satisfied the captain, but not knowing what he would say next, I waited for other questions, reserving my answers according to circumstances.
Mr. Aronnax, will you consent to prescribe for one of my men?
Is he ill?
Yes.
I'm ready to follow you.
Come on, then.
I own my heartbeat. I do not know why. I saw a certain connection between the illness of one of the crew and the events of the day before, and this mystery interested me as much as the sick man. Captain Nemo conducted me to the poop deck of the Nautilus and took me into a cabin situated near the sailors' quarters. There on a bed lay a man about 40 years of age, with a resolute expression of countenance, a true type of an Anglo-Saxon. I leant over him. He was not only ill, he was wounded. His head, swathed in bandages covered with blood, lay on a pillow. I undid those bandages, and the wounded man looked at me with his large eyes and gave no sign of pain as I did it. It was a horrible wound. The skull, shattered by some deadly weapon, left the brain exposed, which was much injured. Clots of blood had formed in the bruised and broken mass, in color like the dregs of wine. There was both contusion and suffusion of the brain. His breathing was slow. Some spasmodic movements of the muscles agitated his face. I felt his pulse, and it was intermittent at best. The extremities of his body were growing cold already, and I saw death must inevitably ensue. After dressing the unfortunate man's wounds, I readjusted the bandages on his head and turned to Captain Nemo. What caused this wound?
What does it signify? A shock has broken one of the levers of the engine, which struck myself. But your opinion as to his state?
I hesitated before giving it.
You may speak. This man doesn't understand French.
I gave a last look at the wounded man. He'll be dead in 2 hours.
Can nothing save him?
Nothing. Captain Nemo's hand contracted, and some tears glistened in his eyes, which I thought incapable of shedding any. For some moments I still watched the dying man, whose life ebbed slowly. His pallor increased under the electric light that was shed over his deathbed. I looked at his intelligent forehead, furrowed with premature wrinkles, produced probably by misfortune and sorrow. I tried to learn the secret of his life from the last words that escaped his lips.
You can go now, Mr. Aronnax,
said the captain. And I left him in the dying man's cabin, returning to my room very much affected by this whole scene. During the whole day, I was haunted by uncomfortable suspicions, and at night I slept badly. Between my broken dreams, I fancied I heard distant sighs, like the notes of a funeral song. Were they the prayers of the dead, murmured in a language I couldn't understand? The next morning I went to the bridge. Captain Nemo was there before me, and as soon as he perceived me, he came to me.
Professor, will it be convenient to you to make a submarine excursion today?
With my companions?
If they like.
We'll obey your orders, Captain.
Would you be so good, then, as to put on your cork jackets?
It was not a question of dead or dying. I rejoined Ned Land and Conseil and told them of Captain Nemo's proposition. Conseil hastened to accept it, and this time the Canadian seemed quite willing to follow our example. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. At 8:30 we were equipped for this new excursion and provided with 2 contrivances for light and breathing. The double door was open, and accompanied by Captain Nemo, who was followed by about a dozen of the crew, we set foot at the depth of about 30 feet on the solid bottom on which the Nautilus rested. A slight declivity ended in an uneven bottom at 15 fathoms depth. This bottom differed entirely from the one I'd visited on my first excursion under the waters of the Pacific. Here there was no fine sand, no submarine prairies, no sea forest. I immediately recognized that marvelous region in which, on that day, the captain did the honors to us. It was the Coral Kingdom. The light produced 1,000 charming varieties, playing in the midst of the branches that were so vividly colored. I seemed to see the membranous and cylindrical tubes tremble beneath the undulation of the waters. I was tempted to gather their fresh petals, ornamented with delicate tentacles, some just blown, others budding, while a small fish, swimming swiftly, touched them slightly, like flights of birds. But if my hand approached these living flowers, the animated, sensitive plants, the whole colony took alarm. The white petals re-entered their red cases, the flowers faded as I looked, and the bush changed into a block of stony knobs. Chance had thrown me just by the most precious specimens of the zoophyte. This coral was more valuable than that found in the Mediterranean, on the coast of France, Italy, and Barbary. Its tints justified the poetical name of flower of blood and froth of blood that trades given to its most beautiful productions. Corals sold for 20 lira per ounce, and in this place the watery beds would make the fortunes of a company of coral divers. This precious matter, often confused with other polypi, formed then the inextricable plots called macchiota, and on which I noticed several beautiful specimens of pink coral. But soon the bushes contract, and the arborizations increase. Real petrified thickets, long joints of fantastic architecture, were disclosed before us. Captain Nemo placed himself under a dark gallery, where by a slight declivity we reached a depth of 100 yards. The light from our lamps produced sometimes magical effects, following the rough outlines of the natural arches and pendants disposed like lustres that were tipped with points of fire. At last, after walking 2 hours, we had attained a depth of about 300 yards, that is to say, the extreme limit on which coral begins to form. But there was no isolated bush, nor modest brushwood at the bottom of lofty trees. It was an immense forest of large mineral vegetations, enormous petrified trees united by garlands of elegant sea bindweed, all adorned with clouds and reflections. We passed freely under their high branches, lost in the shade of the waves. Captain Nemo had stopped. I and my companions halted, and turning round, I saw his men were forming a semicircle around their chief. Watching attentively, I observed that 4 of them carried on their shoulders an object of oblong shape. We occupied, in this place, the center of a vast glade surrounded by the lofty foliage of submarine forest. Our lamps threw over this place a sort of clear twilight that singularly elongated the shadows on the ground. At the end of the glade the darkness increased, and was only relieved by little sparks reflected by the points of coral. Ned Land and Conseil were near me. We watched, and I thought I was going to witness a strange scene. On observing the ground, I saw that it was raised in certain places by slight excrescences. Excrescences? I saw that it was raised in certain places by slight excrescences encrusted with limy deposits and disposed with a regularity that betrayed the hand of man. In the midst of the glade, on a pedestal of rocks roughly piled up, stood a cross of coral that extended its long arms that one might have thought were made of petrified blood. Upon a sign from Captain Nemo, one of these men advanced, and at some feet from the cross he began to dig a hole with a pickaxe he took from his belt. I understood all at once. This glade was a cemetery, this hole a tomb, this oblong object the body of the man who had died in the night. The captain and his men had come to bury their companion in this general resting place at the bottom of this inaccessible ocean. The grave was being dug slowly. The fish fled on all sides while their retreat was being thus disturbed. I heard the strokes of the pickaxe, which sparked when it hit upon some flint lost at the bottom of the waters. The hole was soon large and deep enough to receive the body. Then the bearers approached. The body, enveloped in a tissue of white linen, was lowered into a damp grave. Captain Nemo, with his arms crossed on his chest, and all of the friends of him who had loved them, knelt in prayer. The grave was then filled in with the rubbish taken from the ground, which formed a slight mound. When this was done, Captain Nemo and his men rose. Then, approaching the grave, they knelt again, and all extended their hands in sign of a last adieu. Then the funeral procession returned to the Nautilus, passing under the arches of the forest, in the midst of thickets, along the coral bushes, and still on the ascent. At last the light of the ship appeared, and its luminous track guided us to the Nautilus. At 1 o'clock we had returned. As soon as I had changed my clothes, I went up to the platform, and, a prey to conflicting emotions, I sat down near the binnacle. Captain Nemo joined me, and I rose. and I said to him, "So, as I said he would, this man died in the night?"
Yes, Monsieur Aronnax.
"And he rests now near companions in the Coral Cemetery?"
Yes. Forgotten by all else, but not by us. We dug the grave the polypi undertake to seal our dead for eternity.
And burying his face quickly in his hands, he tried in vain to suppress a sob. Then he added,
Our peaceful cemetery is there, some 100 feet below the surface of the waves.
"Your dead sleep quietly, at least, Captain, out of the reach of sharks."
Yes, sir. Of sharks and men.
Okay. Well, that's one heck of a scene to end part 1 on. Before we dive into part 2, I need to take a moment and have myself some tea. Actually, since we know where we are, I'm going to check the table of contents real quick. Boop. So there are... Are there only 2 parts of this? I thought there were 3. Hang on. Contents. There we go. Oh, that... Oh, you guys can see me actually looking at that. That's fair. Oh, there is only 2 parts to this. There are 23 chapters in the second part. Okay. Obviously, we're not finishing this tonight. We only have an hour left. Hour-ish. But I do believe we'll make plenty of progress. Provided I don't tarry any longer. And you know me. Love to dilly. Love to dally. Part 2, Chapter 1, The Indian Ocean. We now come to the second part of our journey under the sea. The first ended with that moving scene in the Coral Cemetery, which left such a deep impression on my mind. Thus, in the midst of this great sea, Captain Nemo's life was passing, even to his grave, which he'd prepared in one of its deepest abysses. There, not one of the ocean's monsters could trouble the last sleep of the crew of the Nautilus, of those friends riveted to each other as death and in life. Nor any man either, had added the captain. Still the same fierce, implacable defiance toward human society. I could no longer content myself with a theory which satisfied Conseil. That worthy fellow persisted in seeing the commander of the Nautilus one of those unknown savants who return mankind's contempt for indifference. For him, he was a misunderstood genius who, tired of Earth's deceptions, had taken refuge in this inaccessible medium where he might follow his instincts freely. To my mind, this explains but one side of Captain Nemo's character. Indeed, the mystery of that last night in which we had been chained in prison, the sleep and the precaution so violently taken by the captain of snatching from my eyes the glass I raised to sweep the horizon, the mortal wound of that man due to an unaccountable shock of the Nautilus, they all put me on a new track. No, Captain Nemo wasn't satisfied with shunning man. His formidable apparatus not only suited his instinct of freedom, but perhaps also the design of some terrible retaliation. At this moment, nothing's clear to me. I catch but a glimpse of light amidst all the darkness, and I must confine myself to writing as events shall dictate. That day, the 24th of January, 1868, at noon, the second officer came to take the altitude of the sun. I mounted the platform, lit a cigar, and watched the operation. It seemed to me that the man did not understand French, for several times I made remarks in a loud voice, which must have drawn from him some involuntary sign of attention if he had understood them, but he remained undisturbed and unhearing. As he was taking observations with the sexton, one of the sailors of the Nautilus, the strong man who had accompanied us on our first submarine excursion to the island of Crespo, came to clean the glasses of the lantern.
I examined the fittings of the apparatus, the strength of which was increased 100-fold by those lenticular rings placed similar to those in a lighthouse, and which projected their brilliance in a horizontal plane. The electric lamp was combined in such a way as to give it most powerful light. Indeed, it was produced in vacuum, which ensured both its steadiness and its intensity. This vacuum economized the graphite points between which the luminous arc was developed, an important point of economy for Captain Nemo, who could not have easily replaced them, and under these conditions their waste was imperceptible. When the Nautilus was ready to continue its submarine journey, I went down to the saloon. The panel was closed, and the course marked direct west. We were furrowing the waters of the Indian Ocean, a vast liquid plain with a subsurface of 1,200,000,000 acres, and whose waters are so clear and transparent that anyone leaning over them would turn giddy. The Nautilus usually floated between 50 and 100 fathoms deep. We went on, as such, for some days. To anyone but myself, who had a great love for the sea, the hours would have seemed long and monotonous. But the daily walks on the platform, when I steeped myself in the reviving air of the ocean, the sight of the rich waters through the windows of the saloon, the books in the library, the compiling of my memoirs took up all my time and left me not a moment of ennui or weariness. For some days we saw a great number of aquatic birds, sea-mews or gulls. Some were cleverly killed and prepared in a certain way, made very acceptable water game. Amongst large-winged birds carried a long distance from all lands, and resting upon the waves from the fatigue of their flight, I saw some magnificent albatrosses, uttering discordant cries like the braying of a donkey, and birds belonging to the family of the long-wing. As to the fish, they always provoked our admiration when we surprised the secrets of their aquatic life through the open panels. I saw many kinds which I had never before had a chance of observing. I shall notice chiefly ostracions? Obviously that comes from the same root word as I've lost what it is. Never mind. I've lost it. I shall notice chiefly ostracions peculiar to the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and that part which washes the coast of tropical America. These fish, like the tortoise, the armadillo, the sea hedgehog, and the crustacea, are protected by a breastplate which is neither chalky nor stony, but real bone. In some it takes the form of a solid triangle, in others of a solid quadrangle. Amongst the triangular I saw some 1.5 inches in length, with wholesome flesh and a delicious flavor. They're brown at the tail and yellow at the fins, and I recommend their introduction into fresh water, to which a certain number of sea fish easily accustom themselves. I would also mention quadrangular ostracions, having on the back 4 large tubercles, which some dotted over with white spots on the lower part of my body, which may be tamed like birds. Trigons provided with spikes formed by the lengthening of their bony shell, and which, from their strange gruntings, are called sea pigs. Also dromedaries with large humps in the shape of a cone, whose flesh is very tough and leathery. I now borrow from the daily notes of Master Conseil. Certain fish of the genus Petrodon, peculiar to those seas, with red backs and white crests, which are distinguished by 3 rows of longitudinal filaments, and some electrical, 7 inches long, decked in the liveliest colors. Then, as specimens of other kinds, some ovoids, resembling an egg of a dark brown color, marked with white bands and without tails. Diodons, real sea porcupines, furnished with spikes, and capable of swelling in such a way to look like cushions bristling with darts. Hippocampi, common to every ocean. Some pegasi with lengthened snouts, with their pectoral fins being much elongated and formed in the shape of wings, allow, if not to fly, at least to shoot into the air. Pigeon spatulae, with tails covered with many rings of shell. Macrognathi, I'm going to say it that way. Macrognathi, with long jaws, an excellent fish 9 inches long, bright, with most agreeable colors, pale-colored caliomores with rugged heads, and plenty of chepodons, with long and tubular muzzles which kill insects by shooting them, as from an air gun, a single drop of water. These we may call the flycatchers of the sea. In the 89th genus of fishes, classed by Lacipede, belonging to the second lower class of bony, characterized by opercules and bronchial membranes, I remarked the Scorpania, the head of which is furnished with spikes and which has but one dorsal fin. These creatures are covered, or not, with little shells, according to the subclass to which they belong. The second subclass gives us specimens of didactyls 14 or 15 inches in length, with yellow rays and heads of a most fantastic appearance. As to the first subclass, it gives several specimens of that singular-looking fish appropriately called sea frog, with large head, sometimes pierced with holes, sometimes swollen with protuberances, bristling with spikes, and covered with tubercles. It has irregular and hideous horns. Its body and tail are covered with callosities. Its body and tail are covered with callosities. Its sting makes a dangerous wound. It's both repugnant and horrible to look at. From the 21st to the 23rd of January, the Nautilus went at the rate of 250 leagues in 24 hours, being 540 miles or 22 miles an hour. If we recognized so many different varieties of fish, it was because, attracted by the electric light, they tried to follow us. The greater part, however, were soon distanced by our speed, though some kept their place in the waters of the Nautilus for a time. The morning of the 24th, in 12 degrees 5 minutes south latitude and 94 degrees 33 minutes longitude, we observed Keeling Island, a coral formation planted with magnificent cocos, and which had been visited by Mr. Darwin and Captain Fitzroy. The Nautilus skirted the shores of this desert island for a little distance. Its nets brought up numerous specimens of polypi and curious shells of mollusca. Some precious productions of the species of Delphinae enriched the treasures of Captain Nemo, to which I added an Astrea pontificara, a kind of parasite polypus, often found fixed to a shell. Soon Keeling Island disappeared from the horizon, and our course was directed to the northwest, in the direction of the Indian Peninsula. From Keeling Island, our course was slower and more variable, often taking us into great depths. Several times they made use of the inclined planes, which certain internal levers placed obliquely to the waterline. In that way we went about 2 miles, but without ever obtaining the great depths of the Indian Sea, which soundings of 7,000 fathoms have never reached. As to the temperature of the lower strata, the thermometer invariably indicated 4 degrees above zero. I only observed that in the upper regions the water was always colder in the high levels than at the surface of the sea. On the 25th of January the ocean was entirely deserted. The Nautilus passed the day on the surface, beating the waves with its powerful screw and making them rebound to a great height. Who under such circumstances would not have taken it for a gigantic cetacean? 3 parts of this day I spent on the platform. I watched the sea. Nothing on the horizon till about 4 o'clock, a steamer running west on her counter. Her masts were visible for an instant, but she could not see the Nautilus, being too low in the water. I fancy this steamboat belonged to the P.O. Company, which runs from Ceylon to Sydney, touching at King George's Point in Melbourne. At 5 o'clock in the evening, before that fleeting twilight which binds night to day in the tropical zones, Conseil and I were astonished by a curious spectacle. It was a shoal of Argonauts, traveling along on the surface of the ocean. We could count several hundred. They belonged to the tubercle kind, which are peculiar to the Indian seas. These graceful mollusks moved backwards by the means of their locomotive tube, through which they propelled the water already drawn in. Of their 8 tentacles, 6 were elongated and stretched out, floating on the water, while the other 2, rolled up flat, were spread to the wing like a light sail. I saw their spiral-shaped and fluted shells, which Cuvier justly compares to an elegant skiff. A boat indeed! It bears the creature which secretes it without its adhering to it. For nearly an hour the Nautilus floated in the midst of this shoal of mollusks. I knew not what sudden fright they took, but as if at a signal, every sail was furled, the arms folded, body drawn in, the shells turned over, and changing their center of gravity, the whole fleet disappeared under the waves. Never did the ships of a squadron maneuver with more unity. At that moment night fell suddenly, and the reeds, scarcely raised by the breeze, lay peaceably under the sides of the Nautilus. The next day, the 26th of January, we cut the equator at the 82nd meridian and entered the northern hemisphere. During the day, a formidable troop of sharks accompanied us, terrible creatures, which multiply in these seas and make them very dangerous. They were Cetracio philippi, sharks, with brown backs, whitish bellies, armed with 11 rows of teeth, eyed sharks, their throat being marked with a large black spot surrounded with white like an eye. There were also some Isabella sharks, with rounded snouts marked with dark spots. These powerful creatures often hurled themselves at the windows of the saloon with such violence as to make us feel very insecure. At such times, Ned Land was no longer master of himself. He wanted to go to the surface, harpoon the monsters, particularly certain smooth-hound sharks, whose mouth is studded with teeth like a mosaic, and large tiger sharks nearly 6 yards long, the last named of which seemed to excite him more particularly. But the Nautilus, accelerating her speed, easily left behind the most rapid of them. Beep, beep, boop. I agree. Twitch has decided I have a single viewer, even though I am for sure aware there is at least 2 people here. But alas. There may even be 3 people here, actually, depending on whether Loriana is still lurking around over there. But I won't call you out of that. Where was I? 27th of January, that's where I was. The 27th of January, at the entrance to the vast Bay of Bengal, we met repeatedly a forbidding spectacle. Dead bodies floating on the surface of the water. They were dead of the Indian villages, carried by the Ganges to the level of the sea, in which the vultures, the only undertakers of the country, had not been able to devour. But the sharks didn't fail to help them at their funeral work. About 7 o'clock in the evening, the Nautilus, half immersed, was sailing in a sea of milk. At first sight, the ocean seemed lactified. Was it effect of the lunar rays? No. For the moon, scarcely 2 days old, was still hiding under the horizon in the rays of the sun. The whole sky, though lit by the sidereal rays, seemed black by contrast with the whiteness of the water. Conseil could not believe his eyes, and questioned me as to the cause of this strange phenomenon. Happily, I was able to answer him. It's called a milk sea, a large extent of white wavelets, often to be seen on the coast of Amboina, and in these parts of the sea. But, sir, can you tell me what causes an effect? I suppose the water is not really turned into milk. No, my boy. The whiteness which surprises you is caused by the presence of myriads of infusoria, a sort of luminous little worm, gelatinous, without color, about the thickness of a hair, and whose length is not more than 7/1000th of an inch. These insects adhere to each other for sometimes several leagues. Several leagues? Yes, my boy. You need not try to compute the number of these infusoria. You'll not be able, for, if I'm not mistaken, ships have floated on these milk seas for more than 40 miles. Toward midnight, the sea suddenly resumed its usual color, but behind us, even to the limits of the horizon, the sky reflected the whitened waves, and for a long time seemed impregnated with the vague glimmerings of an aurora borealis. Okay. Chapter 2. A novel proposal of Captain Nemo's. On the 28th of February, when at noon the Nautilus came to the surface of the sea, in 9 degrees 4 minutes north latitude, there was land in sight, about 8 miles to westward. The first thing I noticed was a range of mountains about 2,000 feet high, the shapes of which were most capricious. On taking the bearings, I knew we were nearing the island of Ceylon, the pearl which hangs from the lobe of the Indian peninsula. Captain Nemo and his second appeared at this moment. The captain glanced at the map and then turned to me.
The island of Ceylon, noted for its pearl fisheries. Would you like to visit one of them, Monsieur Arnax?
Certainly, Captain.
Well, the thing is easy. Though if we see the fisheries, we shall not see the fishermen. The annual exportation has not yet become active. Never mind. I'll give orders to make for the Gulf of Mannar, where we'll arrive in the night.
The captain said something to his second, who immediately went out. Soon the Nautilus returned to her native element, and the manometer showed that she was about 30 feet deep.
Well, sir, you and your companions shall visit the bank of Manar, and if by chance some fisherman should be there, we'll see him at work.
Agreed, Captain.
By the by, Monsieur Arnox, you're not afraid of sharks?
Sharks? This question seemed a very hard one.
Well,
I admit, Captain, I'm not yet very familiar with that kind of fish.
we're accustomed to them. In time you will be too. However, we shall be armed, and on the road we may be able to hunt some of the tribe. It's interesting. So, till tomorrow, sir, and early.
This said in a careless tone, Captain Nemo left the saloon. Now, if you were invited to hunt a bear in the mountains of Switzerland, what would you say? Very well, tomorrow we'll go and hunt the bear. If you were asked to hunt a lion in the plains of Atlas or the tiger in the Indian jungles, what would you say? Seems we're going to go hunt the tiger or the lion. But when you're invited to hunt a shark in its natural element, you perhaps reflect before accepting the invitation. As for myself, I passed my hand over my forehead, on which stood large drops of cold perspiration. Let's reflect and take our time. Hunting otters in some marine forests, we did that in the island of Crespo. That'll pass, but going up and down at the bottom of the sea where one's almost certain to meet sharks, it's another thing. I know well certain countries, particularly the Andaman Islands, they never hesitate to attack them with a dagger in one hand and a noose in the other, but I also know that few who confront these creatures ever return alive. I'm no native of that area. I think a little hesitation in my case wouldn't be ill-timed here. At this moment, Conseil and the Canadian entered, quite composed and even joyous. They had no idea what was awaiting them. Faith, sir, your Captain Nemo, the devil take him, has just made us a very pleasant offer. Oh, you know, then. If agreeable to you, sir, the commander of the Nautilus has invited us to visit the magnificent Ceylon fisheries tomorrow, in your company. He did it kindly and behaved like a real gentleman. He said nothing more? Nothing more, sir, except that he'd already spoken to you of this little walk. Sir, would you give us some details of the pearl fishery? As to the fishing itself, or the incidents which? On the fishing, before entering the ground, it is as well to know something about it. Very well. Sit down, my friends. I'll teach you something. Ned and Conseil seated themselves on an ottoman, and the first thing the Canadian asks, Sir, what is a pearl? My worthy Ned. To the poet, a pearl is the tear of the sea. To the Orientals, is a drop of dew solidified. To a lady, it is a jewel of an oblong shape, the brilliancy of a mother of pearl substance, which they wear on their fingers, their necks, or their ears. For a chemist, it's a mixture of phosphate and carbonate of lime with a little gelatin. And lastly, for naturalists, it's simply a morbid secretion of the organ that produces the mother of pearl amongst certain bivalves. Those are a branch of mollusk. Precisely so, my learned Conseil. And amongst these testacea, the ear shell, the Trisodne, yes, this testacea, the ear shell, the Trisodne, the turbots, in a word, all those which secrete the mother of pearl, that is, the bluish, violet, or white substance which lines the interior of their shells, are all capable of producing pearls. Mussels too? Oh, yes, mussels of certain waters, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Saxony, Bohemia, France. Good, for the future I will pay attention. But this particular mollusk, which secretes the pearl, is the pearl oyster, the Melgrania margardifect? That seems mistranslated. Melagrina margardifect, that precious pitanidine. The pearl is nothing but a nacreous formation, deposited in a globular form, either adhering to the oyster shell or buried in the folds of the creature. On the shell it's fast, in the flesh it's loose, but always has for a kernel a small hard substance, maybe a barren egg, maybe a grain of sand, around which the pearly matter deposits itself year after year successfully and by thin concentric layers. Are many pearls found in the same oyster? Yes, my boy. Some are a perfect casket. One oyster has been mentioned, although I allow myself to doubt it, as having contained no less than 150 sharks. 150 sharks? Did I say sharks? I meant to say 150 pearls. Sharks wouldn't be sensible. Certainly not, but will you tell us now by what means they extract the pearls? Oh, they proceed in various ways. When they adhere to the shell, the fishermen pull them off with pincers, but the most common way is to lay the oysters on mats of seaweed which cover the banks. Thus they die in the open air, and at the end of 10 days they're in a forward state of decomposition. They're plunged into large reservoirs of seawater, and then they're opened and washed. The price of these pearls varies according to their size. Not only according to their size, but also according to their shape, their water, that is, their color, and their luster, that is, that bright and diapered sparkle, which makes them so charming to the eye. The most beautiful are called virgin pearls, or paragons. They're formed alone in the tissue of the mollusk, are white, often opaque, and sometimes have the transparency of an opal. They are generally round or oval. The round are made into bracelets, the oval into pendants, and being more precious, are sold singly. Those adhering to the shell of the oyster are more irregular in shape. They're sold by weight. Lastly, in a lower order are classed those small pearls known under the name of seed pearls. They're sold by measure. They're especially used in embroidery for church ornaments. Is pearl fishery dangerous? No, particularly if certain precautions are taken. What does one risk in such a calling? The swallowing of some mouthful of seawater? As you say, Ned. By the by, I said, trying to take Captain Nemo's careless tone, are you afraid of sharks, brave Ned? Me, a harpooner by profession? It's my trade to make light of them. But it's not a question of fishing for them with an iron swivel, hoisting them in the vessel, cutting off their tails with the blow of a chopper, ripping them up, throwing their heart into the sea. Then it is a question of, precisely, in the water? In the water. Faith, with a good harpoon, you know, sir, these sharks are ill-fashioned beasts. They turn on their bellies to seize you onions at time. Ned Land had a way of saying seize, which made my blood run cold. Well, and you, Conseil, what do you think of sharks? Me, I'll be frank, sir. So much the better, thought I. If you, sir, mean to face the sharks, I do not see why your faithful servant should not face them with you. All right, Chapter 3. A Pearl of 10 Millions. The next morning, at 4 o'clock, I was awakened by the steward whom Captain Nemo had placed at my service. I rose hurriedly, dressed, and went into the saloon, where Captain Nemo was awaiting me.
Monsieur Aronnax, are you ready to start?
I'm ready.
Then please follow me.
And my companions, Captain?
They've been told, and they're waiting.
Are we to put on our diver's dresses?
Not yet. I've not allowed the Nautilus to come too near this coast. We're some distance from the Manar bank, but the boat's ready, and it'll take us to the exact point of disembarking, which will save us... which will save us a long way. It carries our diving apparatus, which we'll put on when we begin our submarine journey.
Captain Nemo conducted me to the central staircase which led on the platform. Ned and Conseil were already there, delighted at the idea of the pleasure party which was preparing. 5 sailors from the Nautilus, with their oars, waited in the boat, which had been made fast against the tide. The night was still dark. Layers of clouds covered the sky, allowing but few stars to be seen. I looked on the side where the land lay, and saw nothing but a dark line enclosing 3 parts of the horizon, from southwest to northwest. The Nautilus, having returned during the night up to the western coast of Ceylon, was now west of the bay, or rather gulf, formed by the mainland and the island of Manar. There, under the dark waters, stretched the Pitadine bank, and an inexhaustible field of pearls, the length of which is more than 20 miles. Captain Nemo, Ned Land, Conseil, and I took places in the stern of the boat. The master went to his tiller, his 4 companions leaned on their oars, the painter was cast off, and we sheered off. The boat went towards the south. The oarsmen didn't hurry. I noticed that their strokes, strong in the water, was only following each other every 10 seconds, according to the method generally adopted in the Navy. While the craft was running by its own velocity, the liquid drops struck the dark depths of the waves crisply, like spats of melted lead. A little billow, spreading wide, gave a slight roll to the boat, and some samphire reeds flapped before it. We were silent. What was Captain Nemo thinking of? Perhaps the land he was approaching, which he found too near to him, contrary to the Canadian's opinion, who thought it too far off. As to Conseil, he was merely there from curiosity. About 5:30, the first tints on the horizon showed the upper line of coast more distinctly. Flat enough in the east, it rose a little to the south. 5 miles still lay between us, and it was indistinct owing to the mist on the water. At 6 o'clock it became suddenly daylight, with that rapidity peculiar to tropical regions, which know neither dawn nor twilight. The solar rays pierced the curtain of clouds piled up on the eastern horizon, and the radiant orb rose rapidly. I saw land distinctly, with a few trees scattered here and there. The boat neared Bonar Island, which was rounded to the south. Captain Nemo rose from his seat and watched the sea. At a sign from him, the anchor was dropped, but the chain scarcely ran, for it was little more than a yard deep, and this spot was one of the highest points of the bank of the Pitodenes.
Here we are, Monsieur Aronnax. You see that enclosed bay? Here in a month will be assembled the numerous fishing boats of the exporters, and these are the waters their divers will ransack so boldly. Happily, this bay is well situated for that kind of fishing. It's sheltered from the strongest winds. The sea's never very rough here, which makes it formidable for divers' work. We will now put on our dresses and begin our walk.
I didn't answer, and while watching the suspected waves, began with the help of the sailors to put on my heavy sea dress. Captain Nemo and my companions were also dressing. However, none of the Nautilus men were to accompany us on this new excursion. Soon we were enveloped to the throat in india-rubber clothing, the air apparatus fixed to our backs by braces. As for the Ruhmkorff apparatus, there was no necessity for it. Before putting my head into the copper cap, I asked the question of the captain.
They'd be useless. We're going to no great depth. The solar rays will be enough to light our walk. Besides, it would not be prudent to carry the electric light in these waters. Its brilliancy might attract some of the dangerous inhabitants of the coast most inopportunely. As Captain Nemo pronounced these words, I turned to Conseil and Ned Land, but my two friends had already encased their heads in the metal cap, and they could neither hear nor answer. One last question remained to ask of Captain Nemo. Our arms or guns? Guns, what for? Do not mountaineers attack the bear with a dagger in their hand? Is not steel surer than lead? Here's a strong blade. Put it in your belt, and we start.
I looked at my companions. They were armed like us, and more than that, Ned Land was brandishing an enormous harpoon, which he'd placed in the boat before leaving the Nautilus. Then, following the captain's example, I allowed myself to be dressed in the heavy copper helmet, and our reservoirs of air were at once in activity. An instant after we landed, one after the other in about 2 yards of water within even sand, Captain Nemo made a sign with his hand, and we followed him by a gentle declivity until we disappeared under the waves. Over our feet, like coveys of snipe in a bog, rose shoals of fish of the genus Monoptera, which have no other fins but their tail. I recognized the Javanese, a real serpent, 2.5 feet long, of a livid color underneath, and which might easily be mistaken for a conger eel if it were not for the golden stripes on its side. In the genus Stromatius, whose bodies are very flat and oval, I saw some of the most brilliant colors, carrying their dorsal fin like a scythe. An excellent eating fish, which, dried and pickled, is known by the name of carawa. Then some tranquil bars belonging to the genus Aphisodories, whose body is covered with a shell cuirass of 8 longitudinal plates. The heightening sun hit the mass of waters more and more. The soil changed by degrees. To the fine sand succeeded a perfect causeway of boulders, covered with a carpet of mollusks and zoophytes. Amongst the specimens of these branches I noticed some Placinae, with thin, unequal shells of kind of ostration, peculiar to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, some orange Luciniae, with rounded shells, rockfish 3.5 feet long, which raised themselves under the waves like hands ready to seize one. There were also some panopras, slightly luminous, and lastly some oculines, like magnificent fans, forming one of the richest vegetations of these seas. In the midst of these living plants, and under the arbors of the hydrophytes, were layers of clumsy articulates, particularly some Raninae, whose carapace formed a slightly rounded triangle, and some horrible-looking Parthenops. Parthenops? One of those is correct. At about 7 o'clock, we found ourselves at last surveying the oyster banks on which the pearl oysters are reproduced by millions. Captain Nemo pointed with his hand to the enormous heap of oysters, and I could well understand that this mine was inexhaustible, for nature's creative power is far beyond man's instinct of destruction. Ned Land, faithful to his instinct, hastened to fill a net which he carried by his side with some of the finest specimens. But we couldn't stop. We had to follow the captain, who seemed to guide himself by paths only known to him. The ground was sensibly rising, and sometimes, on holding up my arm, it was above the surface of the sea. Then the level of the bank would sink capriciously. Often we rounded high rocks scarped into pyramids. In their dark fractures, huge crustacea, perched upon their high claws like some war machine, watched us with fixed eyes, and under our feet crawled various kinds of annelides. At this moment there opened before us a large grotto, dug in a picturesque heap of rocks, and carpeted with all the thick warp of the submarine flora. At first it seemed very dark to me. The solar rays seemed to be extinguished by successive gradations, until its vague transparency became nothing more than drowned light. Captain Nemo entered, and we followed. My eyes soon accustomed themselves to this relative state of darkness. I could distinguish the arches springing capriciously from natural pillars, standing broad upon their granite base, like the heavy columns of Tuscan architecture. Why had our incomprehensible guide led us to the bottom of this submarine crypt? I was soon to know. After descending a rather sharp declivity, our feet trod the bottom of a kind of circular pit. There Captain Nemo stopped, and with his hand indicated an object I had not yet perceived. It was an oyster of extraordinary dimensions, a gigantic tritacine, a goblet which could have contained a whole lake of holy water, a basin the breadth of which was more than 2.5 yards, and consequently larger than that ornamenting the saloon of the Nautilus. I approached this extraordinary mollusk. It adhered by its filaments to a table of granite, and there, isolated, it developed itself in the calm waters of the grotto. I estimated the weight of this tritacine at 600 pounds. Such an oyster would contain 30 pounds of meat. One must have the stomach of a gargantua to demolish some dozens of them. Captain Nemo was evidently acquainted with the existence of this particular bivalve, and seemed to have a motive in verifying the actual state of it. The shells were a little open. The captain came near and put his dagger between to prevent them from closing. Then with his hand he raised the membrane with its fringed edges, which formed a cloak for the creature. There, between the folded plates, I saw a loose pearl whose size equaled that of a coconut. Its globular shape, perfect clearness, and admirable luster made it altogether a jewel of inestimable value. Carried away by my curiosity, I stretched out my hand to seize it, weigh it, make touch of it, but the captain stopped me, made a sign of refusal, and quickly withdrew his dagger, and the shells closed suddenly. I then understood Captain Nemo's intention. In leaving this pearl hidden in the mantle of this oyster, he was allowing it to grow slowly. Each year the secretions of the mollusks would add new concentric circles. I estimated its value at nearly 500,000 lira at least. After about 10 minutes, Captain Nemo stopped suddenly. I thought he had halted previously to returning, but no. By a gesture, he bade us crouch beside him in a deep fracture of the rock. His hand pointed to one part of the liquid mass, which I watched attentively. About 5 yards from me, a shadow disappeared and sank to the ground. The disquieting idea of sharks shot through my mind, but I was mistaken, and once again it was not a monster of the ocean that we had anything to do with. It was a man, a living man, an Indian, a fisherman, a poor devil who, I suppose, had come to glean before the harvest. I could see the bottom of his canoe anchored some feet above his head. He dived and went up successively. A stone held between his feet, cut in the shape of a sugar loaf, while a rope fastened him to his boat, helped him to descend more rapidly. This was all his apparatus. Reaching the bottom about 5 yards deep, he went on his knees and filled his bag with oysters picked up at random. Then he went up, emptied it, pulled up his stone, and began the operation once more, which lasted about 30 seconds. This diver didn't see us. The shadow of the rock hid us from sight. And how should this man ever dream that men, beings like himself, should be under the water, watching his movements, losing no detail of his fishing? Several times he went up in this way and dived again. He didn't carry more than 10 away at each plunge, for he was obliged to pull them from the bank to which they adhered by means of their strong byssus. And how many of those oysters for which he risked his life had no pearls in them? I watched him slowly. His maneuvers were regular, and for the space of half an hour no danger appeared to threaten him. I was beginning to accustom myself to the sight of this interesting fishing, when suddenly, as the man was on the ground, I saw him make a gesture of terror, rise, and make a spring to return to the surface of the sea. I understood his dread. A gigantic shadow appeared just above the unfortunate diver. It was a shark of enormous size, advancing diagonally, his eyes afire, and his jaws open. I was mute with horror and unable to move. The voracious creature shot toward the Indian, who threw himself on one side to avoid the shark's fins, but not its tail, for it struck his chest and stretched him on the ground. The scene lasted but for a few seconds. The shark returned, and turning on his back, prepared himself for cutting the Indian in two, when I saw Captain Nemo rise suddenly, dagger in hand, walk straight to the monster, ready to fight face to face with him. The very moment the shark was going to snap the unhappy fisherman in two, he perceived his new adversary, and turning over, made straight toward him. I can still see Captain Nemo's position. Holding himself well together, he waited for the shark with admirable coolness, and when it rushed at him, threw himself on one side with wonderful quickness, avoiding the shock and burying his dagger deep into its side. But it wasn't all over. A terrible combat ensued. The shark seemed to roar, if I might say so. The blood rushing in torrents from its wound, the sea was dyed red, and through the opaque liquid I could distinguish nothing more until the moment when, like lightning, I saw the undaunted captain hanging on to one of the creature's fins, struggling, as it were, hand to hand with the monster, and dealing successive blows at his enemy, yet still unable to give a decisive one. The shark's struggles agitated the water with such fury that rocked and threatened to upset me. I wanted to go to the captain's assistance, but nailed to the spot with horror, I couldn't stir. I saw the haggard eye. I saw the different phases of the fight. The captain fell to the earth, upset by the enormous mass which leant upon him. The shark's jaws opened wide like a pair of factory shears, and that would have been all over for the captain. But quick as thought, harpoon in hand, Ned Land rushed toward the shark and struck it with its sharp point. The waves were once again impregnated with a mass of blood. They rocked under the shark's movements, which beat them with indescribable fury. Ned Land had not missed his aim. It was the monster's death rattle. Struck to the heart, it struggled in dreadful convulsions, the shock of which overthrew Conseil. But Ned Land had disentangled the captain, who, getting up without any wounds, went straight to the man, quickly cut the cord which held him to a stone, took him in his arms, and with a sharp blow of his heel mounted to the surface. We all three followed in a few seconds, saved by a miracle, and reached the fisherman's boat. Captain Nemo's first care was to recall the unfortunate man to life again. I didn't think he would succeed. I hoped so, for the poor creature's immersion wasn't long, but the blow from the shark's tail might have been a death blow. Happily, with the captain and Conseil's sharp friction, I saw consciousness return by degrees. He opened his eyes. What was his surprise, his terror even, at seeing 4 great copper heads leaning over him? And above all, what must he have thought? When Captain Nemo, drawing from the pocket of his dress a bag of pearls, placed it in his hand? This munificent charity from the man of the waters to the poor Chingalese was accepted with a trembling hand. His wondering eyes showed that he knew not to what superhuman beings he owed both fortune and light. Sorry, I needed a drink there because I had sneezed. At a sign from the captain, we regained the bank, and following the road already traversed, came, in about half an hour, to the anchor which held the canoe of the Nautilus to the earth. Once on board, we each, with the help of the sailors, got rid of the heavy copper helmet. Captain Nemo's first word was to the Canadian.
Thank you, Master Land.
It was in revenge, Captain. I owed you that. A ghastly smile passed across the captain's lips, and that was all.
To the Nautilus,
said he. The boat flew over the waves, some minutes after we met the shark's dead body floating. By the black marking of its extremity of the fins, I recognized the terrible melanopteron. By the black marking of the extremity of its fins, I recognized the terrible melanopteron. Okay, I clearly cannot say that on the first try ever. Melanopteron of the Indian seas, of the species of sharks so properly called. It was more than 25 feet long. Its enormous mouth occupied a third of its body. It was an adult, which was known by its 6 rows of teeth placed in an isosceles triangle in its upper jaw. Whilst I was contemplating this inert mass, a dozen of these voracious beasts appeared around the boat, and, without noticing us, threw themselves upon the dead body, fought with one another for the pieces. At 8:30 we were again on board the Nautilus. There I reflected on the incidents which had taken place in our excursion to the Manar Bank. 2 conclusions I must inevitably draw from it, one bearing upon the unparalleled courage of Captain Nemo, the other upon his devotion to a human being, representative of the race which he had fled beneath the sea. Whatever he might say, this strange man had not yet succeeded in entirely crushing his heart. When I made this observation to him, he answered in a slightly moved tone.
That Indian, sir, is an inhabitant of an oppressed country, and I'm still, and shall be to my last breath, one of them.
Isn't that well? This was written from a French perspective. Jules Verne was French, so I was like for a second very shocked that somebody from England was calling out the English occupation of India, but no, Jules Verne was French. This is translated. Of course they're gonna call Britain on their nonsense. Make sure nothing's on fire over here. Okay, good, nothing's on fire. Let me just finish this tea. It's gone cold, which this actually, because I think partially because it doesn't have any actual tea leaves in it, it's actually not half bad as it has cooled in the mug. Do I prefer it warm? Absolutely. You get more of the citrus notes, and the licorice note twists differently, so to speak. And you get the mint more. As it cools, it just really just turns into licorice tea that has a little bit of like the ghost of some mint in it, which I don't mind. I actually find quite pleasant. But I think there are some people that would not care for that. But most people don't really care for black licorice anyway, which is kind of the dominant note you get out of this tea anyway, because, it's using licorice root. I also probably should be careful with how much I'm having of it, because it is actual licorice root, and if you eat too much, if you drink too much, or if you eat too much of the root, it's a bronchodilator, and that can become problematic if you drink too much of it. It's more of a problem if you're eating actual licorice root instead of drinking a tea made out of them, but, it's something to be careful about. Granted, to actually do anything aggressively harmful, I'd probably have to drink so much that my stomach would fill first. But, better safe than sorry. I'm not exactly an expert herbalist, as much as I love tea. I should probably actually learn a bit more about, herbs and teas and the like. Might actually let me pick more good tea. Anyway, let's dive into chapter 4. We'll see how much time we have left after chapter 4, but for sure chapter 4. The Red Sea. In the course of the day of the 29th of January, that's the day, the island of Ceylon disappeared under the horizon, and the Nautilus, at a speed of 20 miles an hour, slid into the labyrinth of canals which separate the Maldives from the Lacadives. It coasted even the island of Kiltan, a land originally coralline, discovered by Vasco da Gama in 1499 and one of the 19 principal islands of the Lacadive archipelago, situated between 10 and 14 degrees 30 minutes north latitude and 69 degrees 50 minutes 72 seconds east longitude.
That's very precise seconds.
Can you go below seconds on latitude and longitude, by the way? Or are you decimalizing at that point? Like, can you say, like, 69 degrees, 50 seconds... Or wait, no, it's minutes seconds, isn't it? Oh, I can't remember if it's minutes seconds. I might have been saying this wrong the whole time, by the way. If a single tick is minutes and not seconds. Wait, no, I've been saying minutes. My brain is melting. But, like, can you decimalize even further down to milliseconds? Or are you saying 72.xyz seconds instead of, 69 degrees, 50 minutes, 72 seconds, let's say 58 milliseconds, let's say. Would that be, like, actually notated as, let's say, 69 degrees, 50 minutes, 72 seconds, 58 milliseconds? Would it be notated like that on screen with like 3 ticks, or would you just decimalize from there? Someone with a little bit more of a nautical mind than me, perhaps look that up. That's a Google question. I think it would work very well there. But I have gotten thoroughly distracted. Literally one paragraph into this chapter, shocking no one. We had made 16,220 miles, or 75,000 French leagues, or 7,500 French leagues from our starting point in the Japanese seas. The next day, 30th January, when the Nautilus went to the surface of the ocean, there was no land in sight. Its course was north-northeast, in the direction of the Sea of Oman, between Arabia and the Indian Peninsula, which serves as an outlet to the Persian Gulf. It was evidently a block without any possible egress. Where was Captain Nemo taking us to? I couldn't say. This, however, did not satisfy the Canadian, who that day came to me asking where we were going. We are going where our captain's fancy takes us, Mr. Ned. His fancy cannot take us far, then. The Persian Gulf has no outlet. If we go in, it will not be long before we out again. Very well, then. We'll come out again, Master Land, and if after the Persian Gulf the Nautilus would like to visit the Red Sea, the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb are there to give us entrance. I need not tell you, sir, but the Red Sea is as much closed as the Gulf, as the Isthmus of Suez is not yet cut, and if it was, a boat as mysterious as ours would not risk itself in a canal cut with sluices. I can barely say that word without a French accent. And again, the Red Sea is not the road to take us back to Europe. I never said we were going back to Europe. What do you suppose, then? I suppose that after visiting the curious coasts of Arabia and Egypt, the Nautilus will again go down the Indian Ocean, perhaps cross the Channel of Mozambique, perhaps off the Mascarenas, as to gain the Cape of Good Hope. And once at the Cape of Good Hope, well, we shall penetrate into that Atlantic which we do not yet know. Oh, friend Ned, you're getting tired of this journey under the sea. You're surfeited with the incessantly varying spectacle of submarine wonders. For my part, I'll be sorry to see the end of a voyage which is given to so few men to make. For 4 days, till the 3rd of February, the Nautilus scoured the Sea of Oman at various speeds and various depths. It seemed to go at random, as if hesitating as to which road it should follow, but we never passed the Tropic of Cancer. In quitting this sea, we sighted Muscat for an instant, one of the most important towns in the country of Oman. I admired its strange aspect, surrounded by black rocks upon which its white houses and forts stood in relief. I saw the rounded domes of its mosques, the elegant points of its minarets, its fresh and verdant terraces. But it was only a vision. The Nautilus soon sank under the waves of that part of the sea. We passed along the Arabian coast of Mahra and Hadramut for a distance of 6 miles, its undulating line of mountains being occasionally relieved by some ancient ruin. The 5th of February, we at last entered the Gulf of Aden, a perfect funnel introduced in the neck of Bab el-Mandeb, through which the Indian waters entered the Red Sea. Sorry, I was checking my heater on. Still on. The 6th of February, the Nautilus floated in sight of Aden, perched upon a promontory which a narrow isthmus joins to the mainland, of kind of inaccessible Gibraltar. Gibraltar? I feel like I'm saying that wrong, even though I'm probably close. Y'all know where I mean. You know, the pillars of Gibraltar, the Herculean pillars, limited. Anyway, a kind of inaccessible Gibraltar, the fortifications of which were rebuilt by the English after taking possession in 1839. I caught a glimpse of the octagon minarets of this town, which was at one time the richest commercial magazine on the coast. I certainly thought that Captain Nemo, arrived at this point, would back out again, but I was mistaken, for he did no such thing, much to my surprise. The next day, the 7th of February, we entered the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, the name of which, in the local tongue, means the Gate of Tears. To 20 miles in breadth, it's only 32 in length, and for the Nautilus, starting at full speed, the crossing was scarcely the work of an hour. But I saw nothing, not even the island of Perim, with which the British government has fortified the position of Aden. There were too many English or French steamers of the line of Suez to Bombay, Calcutta to Melbourne, and from Bourbon to the Mauritius, furrowing this narrow passage for the Nautilus to venture to show itself. So it remained prudently below. At last, at about noon, we were in the waters of the Red Sea. I would not even seek to understand the caprice which had decided Captain Nemo upon entering the Gulf, but I quite approved of the Nautilus entering it. Its speed was lessened. Sometimes it kept on the surface, sometimes it dived to avoid a vessel, and thus I was able to observe the upper and lower parts of this curious sea. The 8th of February, from the first dawn of day, Mocha came in sight, now a ruined town whose walls would fall at a gunshot, yet which shelters here and there some verdant date trees. It was once an important city, containing 6 public markets and 26 mosques, and whose walls, defended by 14 forts, formed a girdle of 2 miles in circumference. The Nautilus then approached the African shore, where the depth of the sea was greater. There, between 2 waters clear as crystal, through the open panels we were allowed to contemplate the beautiful bushes of brilliant coral, and large blocks of rock clothed with splendid fur of green variety of sights and landscapes along these sandbanks, algae and fuci. What an indescribable spectacle! What variety of sights and landscapes along these sandbanks and volcanic islands which bound the Libyan coast! But where these shrubs appeared in all their beauty was on the eastern coast, which the Nautilus soon gained. It was on the coast of Tehama, for there not only did this display of zoophytes flourish beneath the level of the sea, but they also formed picturesque interlacings, which unfolded themselves about 60 feet above the surface, more capricious but less highly colored than those whose freshness was kept up by the vital power of the waters. What charming hours I passed thus at the window of the saloon! What new specimens of submarine flora and fauna did I admire under the brightness of our electric lantern! The 9th of February, the Nautilus floated in the broadest part of the Red Sea, which is comprised between Soauken on the west coast and Comfida on the east coast, which is a diameter of 90 miles. That day at noon, after the bearings were taken, Captain Nemo mounted the platform where I happened to be, and I was determined not to let him go down again without at least pressing him regarding his ulterior projects. As soon as he saw me, he approached and graciously offered me a cigar.
Well, sir, does this Red Sea please you? Have you sufficiently observed the wonders it covers? Its fishes, its zoophytes, its parterres of sponges, its forests of coral? Did you catch a glimpse of the towns on its borders?
Yes, Captain Nemo. The Nautilus is wonderfully fitted for such study. Oh, it's such an intelligent boat.
Yes, sir, intelligent and invulnerable.
It fears neither the terrible tempests, the Red Sea, nor its currents, nor its sandbanks. Certainly, this sea is quoted as one of the worst, and in the time of the ancients, if I'm not mistaken, its reputation was detestable.
Detestable, Monsieur Aronnax. The Greek and Latin historians do not speak favorably of it, and Strabo says it's very dangerous during the Etesian winds and in the rainy season. The Arabian Edrisi portrays it under the name of the Gulf of Kulzum, and it relates that vessels perish there in great numbers on the sandbanks, that no one would risk sailing in the night. It is, he pretends, a sea subject to fearful hurricanes, strewn within hospitable islands, and which offers nothing good either on its surface or in its depths. One may see that these historians never sailed on board the Nautilus. Just so. And in that respect moderns are not more advanced than the ancients.
It required many ages to find out the mechanical power of steam. Who knows if in another 100 years we may not see a second Nautilus? Progress is slow, Monsieur Aronnax. It's true, your boat is at least a century before its time, perhaps an era. What a misfortune that the secret of such an invention should die with its inventor. Captain Nemo did not reply to this, and after some minutes' silence he continued.
You were speaking on the opinions of ancient historians upon the dangerous navigation of the Red Sea.
It's true, but were not their fears exaggerated?
Yes and no, Monsieur Aronnax,
replied Captain Nemo, who seemed to know the Red Sea by heart.
That which is no longer dangerous for a modern vessel, well-rigged, strongly built, master of its own course, thanks to the obedient steam, offered all sorts of perils to the ships of the ancients. Picture to yourself those first navigators venturing in ships made of planks sewn with cords of the palm tree, saturated with grease of a sea dog, and covered with powdered resin. They had not even instruments wherewith to take their bearings, and they went by guess amongst currents of which they scarcely knew anything. Under such conditions shipwrecks were, and must have been, numerous. But in our time, steamers have been running between Suez and the South Seas. They have nothing more to fear from the fury of this gulf, in spite of contrary trade winds. The captain and passengers do not prepare for their departure by making propitiatory sacrifices. Why did that word shut down my brain? The captain and passengers do not prepare for their departure by offering propitiatory sacrifices, and on their return they no longer go ornamented with wreaths and gilt fillets to thank the gods of the neighboring temple. I agree with you. Steam seems to have killed all gratitude in the heart of sailors. But, Captain, since you've especially studied this sea, can you tell me the origin of its name? There exist several explanations on the subject, Monsieur Aronnax. Would you like to know the opinion of a chronicler of the 14th century?
Oh, willingly.
This fanciful writer pretends that its name was given to it after the passage of the Israelites, when Pharaoh perished in the waves which closed at the voice of Moses.
A poet's explanation, Captain Nemo, but I cannot content myself with that. I have to ask for your personal opinion.
Don't know why there was an extra page there. Okay. Here it is, Monsieur Aronnax. According to my idea, we must see in this appellation of the Red Sea a translation of the Hebrew word Edom. And if the ancients gave it that name, it was on account of the particular color of its waters.
But up to this time, I've seen nothing but transparent waves, without any particular color.
Very likely, but as we advance to the bottom of the gulf, you'll see this singular appearance. I remember seeing the Bay of Tor entirely red, like a sea of blood.
You attribute this color to presence of microscopic seaweed?
Yes.
So, Captain Nemo, is it not the first time you've overrun the Red Sea on board the Nautilus?
No, sir.
As you spoke a while ago of the passage of the Israelites and the catastrophe to the Egyptians, I have to ask whether you've met with traces under the water of this great historical fact?
No, sir, for good reason.
What is it?
It's the spot where Moses and his people. It is that the spot where Moses and his people passed is now so blocked up with sand, the camels can barely bathe their legs there. You can well understand that there would not be water enough for my Nautilus.
And that spot?
The spot is situated a little above the Isthmus of Suez, in the arm which formerly made a deep estuary when the Red Sea extended to the Salt Lakes. Now, whether the passage was miraculous or not, the Israelites nevertheless crossed there to reach the Promised Land, and Pharaoh's army perished precisely on that spot. I think excavations made in the middle of the sand would bring to light a large number of arms and instruments of Egyptian origin.
That's evident. For the sake of archaeologists, let's hope that these excavations will be made sooner rather than later, when new towns are established on the isthmus after the construction of the Suez Canal. A canal, however, very useless to a vessel like the Nautilus.
Very likely, but useful to the whole world. The ancients would well understand the utility of communication between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean for their commercial affairs, but they didn't think of digging a canal direct. Took the Nile as an intermediate. Very probably the canal which united the Nile to the Red Sea was begun by Sesostris, if we may believe tradition. One thing is certain: in the year 615 before Jesus Christ, Necos undertook the works of an elementary canal, the waters of the Nile across the plain of Egypt, looking toward Arabia. It took 4 days to go up this canal. It was so wide that 2 triremes could go abreast. It was carried on by Darius, the son of Hypastasis, and probably finished by Ptolemy II. Strabo saw it navigated, but its decline from the point of departure, near Bubastis, to the Red Sea was so slight, it was only navigable for a few months in the year. This canal answered all commercial purposes to the age of Antonius, when it was abandoned and blocked up with sand. Restored by the order of Caliph Omar, it was definitely destroyed in 761 or 762 by Caliph al-Mansur, who wished to prevent the arrival of provisions to Muhammad ben Abdallah, who had revolted against him. During the expedition into Egypt, your General Bonaparte discovered traces of the works in the desert of Suez, and, surprised by the tide, he nearly perished before regaining Hadjarath, the very place where Moses had encamped 3,000 years before him. Well, Captain, what the ancients dared not undertake, this junction between the two seas, it'll shorten the road from Cadiz to India. Monsieur Lesseps has succeeded in doing, and before long you'll have changed Africa into an immense island. Yes, Monsieur Aronnax, you have the right to be proud of your countrymen. Such a man brings more honor to a nation than great captains. He began, like many others, with disgust and rebuffs, but he's triumphed, for he has the genius of will. And it's sad to think a work like that, which ought to have been an international work, would have sufficed to make a reign illustrious, should have been succeeded by the energy of one man. All honor to Monsieur Lesseps.
Yes, honor to the great citizen, I replied, surprised in the manner by which Captain Nemo had just spoken.
Unfortunately, I can't take you through the Suez Canal, but you will be able to see the long jetty of Port Said after tomorrow, when we'll be in the Mediterranean.
The Mediterranean?
Yes, sir. Does that astonish you?
What astonishes me is to think we'll be there the day after tomorrow.
Indeed?
Yes, Captain, although by this time I ought to have accustomed myself to being surprised at nothing since I've been on board your boat.
But what's the cause of this surprise?
Well, it's the fearful speed you'll have to put on the Nautilus. If the day after tomorrow she's to be in the Mediterranean, we'll have to have made the round of Africa and doubled the Cape of Good Hope.
Who told you she'd be making the round of Africa and doubling the Cape of Good Hope, sir?
Well, unless the Nautilus sails on dry land, passing above the isthmus.
Below it, Monsieur Aronnax.
Beneath it?
Certainly. A long time ago nature made under this tongue of land what man has this day made on its surface.
I know, not the Suez Canal. Blocked by the world's favorite boat, the Evergreen. The Ever Given, rather. Evergreen is the transport company that manages it. What? Such a passage exists?
Yes, a subterranean passage, which I've named the Arabian Tunnel. It takes us beneath Suez, opens into the Gulf of Pelusium.
This isthmus is composed of nothing but quicksand.
To a certain depth, but at 55 yards there is a solid layer of rock.
How in the world did you discover this passage? Did you do it by chance?
Chance and reasoning, sir, and by reasoning even more than chance. Not only does this passage exist, but I have profited by it several times. Without that, I should not have ventured this day into the impassable Red Sea. I noticed that in the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean there existed a certain number of fishes, a kind perfectly identical. Certain of the fact, I asked myself, was it possible there was no communication between the two seas? If there was, the subterranean current must necessarily run from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, from the sole cause of difference of level. I caught a large number of fishes in the neighborhood of Suez. I passed a copper ring through their tails and threw them back. Some months later, on the coast of Syria, I caught some of my fish ornamented with this ring. Thus the communication between the two was proved. I then sought for it with my Nautilus. I discovered it, ventured into it, and before long, sir, you too will have passed through my Arabian tunnel.
Okay, folks. As much as I want to continue reading and learning about the Arabian Tunnel, we are going to have to save that for next week. I'll keep it brief. This has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.